The year was 1873, and the wind never stopped. It blew out of the south, carrying grit that tasted like the end of the world and the smell of cattle driven hard. It was a dry wind, a lonely wind, and it scoured the big prairie flat, leaving nothing but tough grass, blue mountains that were only a promise in the distance, and the hard, empty sky. Out here, on the raw border between Texas and the Indian Territory, the road was just a suggestion, 2 ruts worn into the crust of the earth, and where those ruts crossed a muddy creek, there was Blake's Crossing. It was not a town. It was a wound held open. A few buildings of raw, unpainted lumber huddled together as if for warmth, a main house that served as an eatery and saloon, a sagging stable, and a half-dozen small rooms out back for men who wanted a bed for the night. It was a place where cattle drovers, miners with dust in their beards, soldiers in stained blue, and drifters with no names all washed up together. The air smelled of stale whiskey, old sweat, horse manure, and the sharp, clean bite of lye soap. Inside the main house, in the kitchen, Evelyn Blake felt the heat rising from the big iron stove. It was a different heat from the prairie, thick and wet, sticking her calico dress to the small of her back. She was 21 years old, but some days she felt as old as the hills. She was wiping down a heavy glass, her knuckles white, beyond the pass-through window. She could hear the clink of poker chips and the low rumble of men's voices. She served the food, she cooked the food, she took the coins, her fingers brushing against hands that were calloused or soft, clean or filthy, and she endured the looks, the drovers, full of cheap whiskey and trail dust. Their eyes stripped her naked as she walked by with a tray of beef stew. The miners, quieter, weighed her with their gaze, as if she were an ore sample they were deciding whether to dig. She was a good girl, a virgin, and her father had raised her to be proper. In a place like this, that just made her a prize. Her father, Thomas Blake, stood behind the bar. He was a thick man, his hair graying, his face sagging with a weariness that went beyond his years. He was a former soldier, had fought in the war between the states, and he had never quite come home. He poured a whiskey for a freighter, his hand shaking just a little. He caught her eye and gestured her over. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and rough. He did not like her out in the main room when it got dark. "Go check the supplies in the back." She nodded, grateful for the excuse. As she passed him, he put a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You remember what I told you," he muttered, not looking at her, staring instead at the bottles on the wall. "You marry a decent white man, a deputy, maybe someone who owns cattle. You hear me? Do not get mixed up with these gamblers, or them." He nodded toward the dark prairie beyond the door. He meant the Comanche. Evie knew. He hated them. But sometimes, late at night, when the whiskey had unlocked something in him, he would mutter about the war. "We did bad things," he would whisper into his glass. "The blue uniforms. We did bad things." He was a man afraid of the Comanche, but he seemed just as afraid of his own memories. The bat-wing doors swung open, letting in a swirl of dust and the fading purple light of dusk. A man in a clean blue uniform stepped inside, his boots polished so bright they reflected the lantern light. This was Captain Nathan Reed. He was sharp, ambitious, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky. 2 soldiers followed him, their uniforms less clean, their faces tired. "Thomas," Reed said, his voice smooth and confident. He did not smile with his eyes. He took off his gloves, slapping them lightly against his thigh. "A hard ride. Whiskey for my men. Coffee for me, Captain." Thomas Blake nodded, his expression unreadable. He poured the drinks. Evie went to the stove to pour the coffee. She brought it to Reed's table. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her, any more than he would acknowledge a piece of furniture. He was busy looking at her father. "Big changes are coming." "Thomas," Reed said, blowing on the steaming coffee, "the railroad has approval. They are pushing the line south of here." Thomas Blake just grunted, wiping the bar with a dirty rag. "This whole territory is going to open up," Reed continued, his voice full of a cold fire. "Towns will spring up. There will be civilization out here, but first he took a sip. We have to clear the way. From the kitchen doorway. Evie watched him. She knew what he meant. Clearing the way. He meant the Comanche. There are bands still refusing to go to the reservation, Reed said, as if talking about the weather. They are a menace. They are slowing progress. It is time to clean them out. For good. He looked directly at Thomas Blake. The army is going to be very active, and we will remember who our friends are. The railroad will need beef. The soldiers will need supplies. A man who helps us. A man who stands with us. Will find himself very prosperous when this is all over. A shiver ran down Evie's spine. A coldness that had nothing to do with the evening air. Reed's voice was the sound of a steel trap closing, far from the smoky light of the saloon. On a high ridge overlooking the crossing, a man lay flat on the warm stone. The wind moved through his long black hair, but he was as still as the rock itself. His name was Hawk. Among his people, he was Takani, the lonely hawk. He held a battered brass spyglass to his one good eye. He had been watching the stopping post for 3 days. He watched the cattle pass. He watched the wagons. He saw everything. He saw the blue uniforms arrive. His body tensed. He hated that color. It was the color of fire and screams. He swept the spyglass across the front of the saloon, lingering on the horses. He recognized the brand of a bounty hunter, Chance Murphy, a white man who hunted Comanche for money, who sold scalps to traders in the East. Hawk's hand moved to the knife at his hip. Then he moved the glass to the main house. He saw the girl, Evelyn. He did not know her name, but he knew her shape. He had watched her hang laundry in the back, the wind pressing her dress against her legs. He had watched her feed chickens, her head bent, her brown hair catching the sun. She was part of this place. She was a white woman, like all the others. But he watched her. He saw her move through the main room, her back straight, carrying heavy trays. He saw the men look at her. He saw her face, tight and controlled. She was not fragile. She looked trapped. His gaze flicked back to the men at the table. Captain Reed. He knew that face. Reed was new, but he had the same arrogance as the one before him. The one who had led the raid. The memory came, sharp and unwelcome. The smell of smoke in the dawn. The sound of shouting. His mother, pushing him toward the creek. Hide, Takani, do not make a sound. The soldiers, accusing his father of stealing horses. A lie. It was always a lie. An excuse to take the land, to take the water. He had hidden in the reeds, breathing through a hollow stalk. While he closed his eyes. He had survived. He had vowed that day that he would never trust the white man. He would never believe their words. He stayed on this land because it was his. Because his people still used the hidden paths, because there was a spring in the canyon that the soldiers did not know about. He was the watcher. He was the hawk. And he would protect this place, even if it meant watching the people he hated most. Back at the crossing, the light had almost faded. Most of the drovers had moved on. It was quiet. 2 figures appeared out of the dusk. They did not ride. They walked. An old Comanche man and an old woman. They were thin, their clothes patched. They moved with a slow, beaten dignity. Thomas Blake came out onto the porch, a rifle held loosely in his hand. "What do you want?" he called. The old man held up 3 good beaver pelts. He spoke in broken English. Trade, flour, salt. Thomas spat on the ground. But business was business. Half a sack of flour, a pound of salt, that is all. It was less than half what the pelts were worth. The old man nodded, his face a mask. Evie, who had followed her father out, felt a small sting of shame. They made the trade. Thomas threw the sack on the porch. "Take it and go. Do not come back after dark." The old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, reached for the sack. Her moccasin, worn and thin, caught on the edge of the porch step. She stumbled, crying out softly as she fell to her knees. Before Thomas could scream at her, Evie had stepped forward. She reached down and took the old woman's arm. "Are you hurt?" Evie asked. And then, from a place she had buried deep, a few words from her mother came back. Her mother, who had been kind to everyone. Her mother, who had secretly taken food and medicine to Comanche prisoners years ago, earned the scorn of the town. Her mother, who had died of a fever. But Evie always felt she had really died of loneliness. Evie looked at the old woman and spoke, her voice soft, the words clumsy on her tongue. "Wikiti, be careful." The old woman's head snapped up, her eyes, dark and cloudy, suddenly sharpened. She stared at Evie, her mouth open in shock. The old man froze, his hand flying to his knife. Evie let go, stepping back, her face flushing. She had not meant to. The old woman looked at Evie, a long, searching look. Then she touched her own chest, a gesture of respect. She grabbed the sack, and the two of them vanished into the darkness as silently as they had come. Thomas Blake grabbed his daughter's arm. "What did you say?" he hissed. "What did you say to them?" "Nothing." "Pa," she whispered, pulling her arm away. Just to be careful." He stared at her, suspicion in his eyes. But Reed called his name from inside, and he let it go. Later that night, the last of the customers were gone. It was just Evie, her father, and Captain Reed, sitting by the dying fire. Reed was drinking Thomas's best whiskey now, the bottle half empty. "We will push them north of the river," Reed was saying, his voice slurring slightly, but his eyes still cold. He had a map, and he was drawing lines on it with his finger. "This land is for us. It was given to us. There's only room for one kind of person here. Thomas, one kind. And it is not them." Thomas Blake, his own eyes glassy, just nodded, "One kind." Evie was wiping down the last table, her hands raw from the hot water and lye. She felt sick. The air in the room was thick with smoke and hate. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Needing to see the clean, empty darkness, she looked out at the prairie, a black sea under a million stars. And she saw him, far away, on the ridge, silhouetted against the deep, star-brushed purple of the sky. A man on a horse. He was perfectly still, like a statue carved from the night itself. He was the loneliest thing she had ever seen. She did not know who he was. She did not know he had been watching her. She only knew that he was out there, in the vast, dangerous dark. She felt a strange, impossible pull toward that distant, lonely shape. She was lonely here, in this room full of men and smoke. He was lonely out there, on his hill. Her hand, still dusty with flour from baking, rose to the glass. She pressed it there, as if to shield her eyes, to see him better. On the ridge. Hawk lowered his spyglass. He had watched the light in her window. He stayed, unmoving, for a long time. Two worlds, separated by a mile of dark grass, already closer than either of them knew. The following day, a different kind of dust cloud appeared on the horizon. This one was not made by cattle. It was a freight convoy. 3 heavy wagons pulled by sweating mule teams, and flanked by a dozen armed men. They were not soldiers. They were hard cases, freighters and hunters. Their clothes a mix of buckskin and filthy canvas. The wagons rolled to a stop in front of Blake's crossing, the drivers shouting and cracking their whips. The saloon, quiet in the midday heat, suddenly filled with new noise. Evie, who was kneading dough for the evening's bread, felt the familiar knot in her stomach. New men meant new problems. Her father went out onto the porch. Evie saw him talking to the leader, a man she did not recognize. But she recognized the one who swung down from the lead wagon, laughing a harsh, barking laugh. Chance Murphy. He was a man who seemed to be made of grease and old leather. His hair was long and matted under a crumpled hat. A brace of pistols sat low on his hips, and a long knife was strapped to his leg. He walked into the saloon as if he owned it, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. He slapped a silver dollar on the bar. "Whiskey. Old man," he boomed at Thomas Blake. "And keep it coming. We are hauling for the army, and it is thirsty work." He turned, leaning his back against the bar, and surveyed the room. His eyes, small and quick, missed nothing. They found Evie in the kitchen doorway. He grinned, showing brown, broken teeth. "Well now," he said, his voice dropping into a slimy, familiar tone. "Look who is all growed up." Still here, little Evie? Your PA has not found a man to take you off his hands yet." Evie's face burned, but she said nothing. She turned to go back to the kitchen, but he was not finished. "Wait, now! Come see what I brought." He swaggered back toward the door, gesturing for the room to look. He pointed to his saddle, which was slung over the back of his horse. Tied to the leather strings, dark and stiff, were 3 scalps. The hair was long and black. They were small. One of them, horribly, was braided with blue beads. A few of the freighters in the room cheered. "Good work." Chance one of them yelled, "That is 3 less of the heathen." Evie felt the bile rise in her throat. She saw Maggie O'Reilly, the Irish widow who helped in the kitchen, cross herself, her face pale. Thomas Blake's face went hard, but he said nothing. He just poured the whiskey. Chance Murphy laughed again. "The Army pays well. Captain Reed, he likes a clean country, and I am the man to clean it." He took his whiskey, downed it in one gulp, and slammed the glass on the bar. "Another." Evie fled to the kitchen. She punched her fist into the dough, her knuckles white. She hated him. She hated the men who cheered him. She hated the smell of the whiskey and the sound of their laughter. But most of all, she hated the silence of her father, who took the man's silver dollar and said nothing. That night, the ridge was cold. Hawk lay on his belly, the stone chilling him through his shirt. He had watched the wagons arrive. He had seen Chance Murphy. He had seen the long crates, marked with the stamp of the United States Army, rifles, ammunition. He had watched Murphy preen in the saloon, seen the dark trophies on his saddle. He tasted ash in his mouth. One of the scalps looked like the hair of his cousin's daughter. He closed his eyes, forcing the image away. Rage was a fire that burned the man who held it. He needed to be cold. He needed to be still. He knew what the guns were for. Captain Reed was not just talking. He was planning. He was arming. This was not a supply run for a distant fort. This was a gathering of tools for a local war. His plan was simple. He would watch. He would see where they stored the wagons. He would wait for them to sleep, the whiskey making them stupid. Then he would slip down, mark the axle of the main wagon, a deep cut that would snap when it took a load. He would not destroy it here, not at the post. That would bring immediate reprisal, but he would make it fail on the road. A day's delay, maybe 2, enough time for him to get back to the main camp, to warn the elders. Enough time to move the women and children to the high caves. He settled in, the wind his only companion. He would wait for the moon to fall. Inside the saloon, the air was thick. The freighters and Murphy's men were drinking hard. They had been joined by a half-dozen soldiers from the fort, who had ridden in when they heard the supply wagons had arrived. The room was loud, full of smoke and boasting. Evie moved through the tables, her face a mask. She served stew and beer, her body rigid. Every time she passed Chance Murphy, his hand would snake out, trying to brush her skirt, her arm. She was fast, and she had been avoiding drunken hands for 10 years, but it wore her down. "Sing us a song," Evie, one of the soldiers, shouted, his face red with drink. "Leave her be," her father said, his voice tired. "She is not part of the entertainment." "Oh, let her have some fun," Murphy slurred. Grabbing another bottle, he was very drunk. He pulled out his pistol. "Let us have a salute to the United States Army." He staggered toward the door and fired his pistol into the night sky. 1 shot, 2. The other soldiers, thinking this was a fine game, followed him. They stumbled out onto the porch, a cluster of loud, drunken men. They began firing their rifles and pistols at the stars, at the moon, at the darkness, whooping and shouting. They passed bottles back and forth. "Pa, make them stop," Evie pleaded, her hands over her ears. "They are soldiers, Evie." "I cannot make them do nothing." Thomas turned his back, polishing a glass that was already clean. A young boy, Miguel, who worked in the stables for a few pennies a day, had been drawn by the noise. He was Mexican, an orphan, and he slept in the hayloft. He peeked around the corner of the stable, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement at the flashing guns. One of the soldiers, a corporal with a sloppy grin, saw the movement. "Hey, what is that?" he yelled. "It is a Comanche." He swung his rifle, not aiming, just firing in the direction of the shadow. The sound of the shot was followed by a different sound, a thin, high scream, a sound that was cut off, ending in a wet cough. The shooting stopped. The silence that fell was sudden and heavy. "What was that?" a soldier asked, his voice suddenly sober. Evie did not wait. She ran from the kitchen, pushing past the men on the porch. She ran toward the stable, her feet slipping in the mud. She found him. Miguel was lying on his side, his hands clutching his chest. A dark stain was spreading over his thin shirt. His eyes were wide, looking at her. He tried to speak, but only a bubble of blood appeared on his lips. "No," Evie whispered. She fell to her knees beside him. "No, no, Miguel." The men had followed her. They stood in a half circle, their guns hanging at their sides. The corporal who had fired the shot was staring, his face the color of spoiled milk. "I thought," he stammered. Captain Reed, who had been inside with Thomas, pushed through the men. He took in the scene in one sharp glance, the boy on the ground, Evie kneeling in the mud, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him, the guilty, terrified faces of his soldiers. Reed's face became a mask of cold fury. Before anyone could speak, before the corporal could confess, Reed's voice cut through the night. "Comanche," he said, his voice low and sharp. He was shot from a distance. A cowardly arrow, or a rifle from the rocks. Evie's head snapped up. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "No, she pointed at the corporal. "He shot him. We all saw it. He was drunk. He thought Reed moved so fast she did not have time to react. He was suddenly in front of her, his face inches from hers. His hand clamped down on her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. His voice was a poison whisper. "For her alone. If Blake's girl opens her mouth," he hissed, his eyes boring into hers, "the whole family will be seen as friends of the Reds. You will be traitors. Your father's business will be burned. And you," he let his eyes travel down her body, "will be left for men like Chance Murphy to deal with. Do you understand me?" Evie could not breathe. She could only stare at the hatred in his eyes. She saw him. He was a monster. She nodded, a tiny, jerking movement. Reed let her go, pushing her arm away as if it were dirty. He turned back to the men. "It is a tragedy," he announced. "These savages will stop at nothing. They kill children now. On the ridge." Hawk heard the sudden burst of gunfire. It was not one shot. There were many. Then he heard the scream, a child's scream. His blood ran cold. This was it, the attack. They were attacking the post, but his people were not there. Were they? Had a hunting party come too close? Was this a trap? He saw the men in the dark, shapes milling around. He heard another shout, this one full of anger. He saw a man pointing, not at the hills, but at the stable. He was confused, but the gunfire had been real, and the wagons of rifles were still there. He had to act. He had to stop those guns from being used against his people. He nocked an arrow. He did not aim at a man. He was not a murderer. He was a warrior. He aimed at the lead wagon. The one he knew held the ammunition. He aimed for the big rear wheel. A broken wheel would stop the wagon. It would delay them. He drew the bowstring back to his ear. The wind was low. He let the arrow fly. It sailed through the dark, a silent messenger. It struck the wheel with a heavy, solid sound. A thunk. But it was stronger than he knew. The arrow, a heavy shaft made for hunting, did not just stick in the wood. It hit a spoke and followed the grain, splitting it. The axle, already bearing a heavy load, gave a groan of tortured wood. With a crack like a pistol shot, the axle snapped. The wagon lurched, tipped, and then fell over with a crash, spilling heavy crates onto the hard-packed earth. One of the crates, the one marked with a red symbol, burst open, a case of ammunition. It slid and struck a loose piece of iron from the broken wheel. The explosion was a flash of white-hot light that lit up the prairie. It was a roar that shook the ground, throwing the men on the porch to their knees. The wagon dissolved into a cloud of splinters and fire. Bullets cooked off in the flames, zipping through the night in all directions. Comanche attack Reed roared. Pulling his own pistol, he fired into the darkness. At the hills, they are attacking to arms. They are in the rocks. Evie, who had been pushed aside by Reed, had scrambled back toward the saloon. She was at the window. The fire from the wagon lit up the world. She saw the men running in circles, shouting, firing at shadows. And she looked at the ridge. She saw him, the man on the horse, the lonely shadow from the night before. He was just sitting there, on his horse, watching the fire. He was not shooting. He was not leading a charge. He was just watching. As she watched, the terrified horses from the stable, set free by the explosion, burst out and began to stampede, their eyes white. They were running straight toward the burning, exploding wagon. The man on the hill suddenly moved. He put his fingers to his mouth and let out a whistle, a sound so sharp and strange it cut through the chaos, like the cry of a real hawk. The lead horses, trained for the prairie, heard it. They checked, turned, and veered away from the fire, thundering off into the safe darkness. He had saved them. Evie stared, her mind reeling. Reed was yelling about an attack, but the man on the hill had not attacked. He had shot the wagon, but he had saved the horses. It did not make sense. Nothing made sense. Reed is right, Chance Murphy yelled, his face alive with a terrible, drunken joy. He held up his rifle. They have started it. Let us finish it. Let us get some hair. He is right, Reed said, his voice full of authority. All traces of his own men's guilt now buried under the fire and smoke. They have declared war, and we will answer. We ride at dawn. We will sweep their camps. We will find the nest that launched this attack, and we will burn it to the ground. He turned to his soldiers. Corporal, see the boy's body? The rest of you, secure the post. Murphy, you and your men can ride with us. I am formally deputizing you. Chance Murphy grinned. It will be a pleasure, Captain. A real pleasure. Evie had backed away from the window, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Miguel was dead, and they were using his death, a death they had caused, to start a war. She searched for her father. He was not on the porch. He was standing near the corner of the saloon, in the shadows, just out of the firelight. Captain Reed walked over to him. Evie watched, frozen. She could not hear the words, but she saw the movements. Reed was talking, his hands moving. Her father was not looking at him. He was looking at the ground. Then Reed reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small leather bag. Evie knew the sound it made, the sound of coins. He pressed it into her father's hand. Thomas Blake looked at the bag. He held it for a long second. Then his fingers closed around it, and he slipped it into his own pocket. He nodded. Once. Evie felt the last of her strength leave her. She leaned against the wall, the rough wood biting into her back. Her father had taken the money. He had sold the truth. He had sold Miguel's life for a bag of coins. The conflict was no longer just in her head. It was in her stomach, a sickening, hot poison. Her family, her safety, her home. It was all built on this, a lie, paid for in blood and silver, while a dead boy lay cooling in the mud, and out on the hill. A man she did not know, a man she was supposed to hate, had just saved her father's horses. Dawn broke hard and clean, a pale yellow line under a steel-gray sky. The air at Blake's Crossing was cold, carrying the metallic smell of the night's explosion and the faint, sick scent of death. They had wrapped Miguel's body in a piece of canvas and put him in the small, cold shed where they kept the ice. Evie had not slept. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands scrubbed raw, and watched the light change. Her father was already outside, his face gray, his hands shaking as he served coffee to the soldiers and Chance Murphy's men. They were checking their rifles, loading their horses, their voices loud and brittle in the morning air. They were a posse, a lynch mob. Just after sunrise, the column formed. Captain Reed, his uniform immaculate, sat on a tall black horse. He looked over the collection of men, a dozen soldiers, and another dozen hard cases led by Chance Murphy. They were ready. They did not ride out immediately. Reed trotted his horse over to the porch, where Thomas Blake stood wiping his hands on his apron. "Thomas," Reed called, his voice pleasant. A moment. Her father walked out, his boots dragging in the dust. "Captain, my men will be on the move for 2, maybe 3 days," Reed said, coiling his reins. "They will ride hard, and they will need hot food. My own cook was inconvenienced by last night's attack. I cannot help you." "Captain," Thomas stammered, "I have a post to run." Reed's smile did not change. "I was not asking you." "Thomas, I am telling you. Your daughter. She cooks. She will come with us. We have the kitchen wagon from the freight convoy. She will manage it." The world stopped. Evie, standing in the doorway, felt her blood turn to ice. "No," Thomas Blake said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "No, Captain. She is a girl. She is my daughter. I cannot—" Reed leaned down from his saddle, his voice dropping so only her father could hear. But the menace in it carried all the way to Evie. You will, or I will close this place today. I will post a guard and declare it unsafe, a den of Indian sympathizers. You took my money to be quiet. Now you will take my orders to show your loyalty." He straightened up. "Or perhaps you would prefer I let Mr. Murphy here ask her. He seems quite taken with her." Chance Murphy, who was listening, let out a low laugh and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Thomas Blake looked at Murphy. He looked at Reed. He looked at the smoking ruin of the wagon. Then he looked at the ground. He seemed to shrink, all the life going out of him. "She will need her things," he muttered. "No," Pa Evie cried, stepping out onto the porch. "You cannot. Please, her father would not look at her." He just turned and walked back inside. His shoulders slumped. "Get your coat, Evelyn," he said, his voice dead. "Do as the man says." It was not a request. It was a sentence. 10 minutes later, she was on the broad seat of the kitchen wagon. It was a lumbering, heavy thing, loaded with sacks of flour, beans, and salted meat. A young, nervous soldier sat beside her, holding the reins. She had a small bag at her feet, containing a change of clothes and her mother's hairbrush. Her father had not come out to say goodbye. He stayed inside, behind the bar, with a bottle. As the column began to move, Evie saw Maggie O'Reilly rush out, her face pale with concern. Maggie ran alongside the wagon, holding up a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "Here, girl," she panted, pushing it into Evie's hands. "It is bread and a bit of cheese. You should be careful. You keep your eyes down and you be careful." "Thank you, Maggie," Evie whispered, her throat tight. The wagon lurched, and the column moved out. Evie did not look back. She stared straight ahead, at the endless, empty prairie that was about to swallow her. This was the first time in her life she had been more than 2 miles from Blake's Crossing. She was terrified, but beneath the terror, a strange, cold curiosity stirred. She was finally leaving. She just never thought it would be like this. The men rode with a grim purpose. They were not talking much, but Evie could hear scraps of their conversation. "Hit the camp at Red Willow, not leave one of them standing. Reed says to clear them out." Women and all Evie pulled her thin coat tighter. These men were not going out to arrest anyone. They were going out to murder. And she was being forced to cook them supper afterward, far to the north. Hawk watched them come. He had been on the move all night, racing back to warn his people. But he was too late. He had seen the main camp packing, moving west toward safety. But he knew, with a sickening certainty, where the column was heading. They were not heading for the main camp. They were heading for the valley of the Red Willow. It was a small, sheltered place, a place the soldiers did not know about, a place where the women and the children and the old ones often went to gather medicine roots and choke cherries. It was supposed to be safe. His arrow, his single, stupid arrow. He had meant to delay them, to give his people time. Instead, he had given Reed an excuse. The explosion. The fire it had given Reed the righteous anger he needed to rally the men. And now they were riding, not on a simple patrol, but on a mission of vengeance. And he, Hawk, had painted the target. He felt a guilt so sharp it was like a knife in his gut. He was a warrior. His job was to protect, and he had failed. He spurred his horse, a desperate, frantic ride. He could not fight them all. 30 armed men, but he had to get there first. He had to divert them. He had to lead them away from the valley. He raced through the arroyos, his horse's hooves pounding the dry earth, praying to the spirits of his fathers that he would not be too late. The sun was high and hot when the column reached the entrance to a narrow canyon. The soldier driving Evie's wagon, a boy named Harris, wiped the sweat from his face. "Thank the Lord," he muttered. "Some shade." But the canyon was not a relief. The high red rock walls pressed in, making the wagon's wheels echo. The air was still and hot. The men fell silent. Their horses, sensing the close space, became nervous, tossing their heads. Evie felt it, too. A prickling on the back of her neck. This place was wrong. "Keep your eyes sharp. Men!" Reed's voice bounced off the walls. Ideal spot for an ambush. Chance Murphy rode up beside Reed. "It will not be Comanches," he said, his eyes scanning the ridges. "They do not like to fight in boxes. They like the outdoors. This is more like Apache land. They will fight where we find them," Reed said stubbornly. A rifle shot cracked the air. It was not an arrow. It was a loud, heavy bullet that took the soldier just in front of the wagon, knocking him clean from his saddle. "Ambush," Reed roared. "To the rocks, it is the Comanches." But as the men scrambled, another volley of shots rang out from the ridges, and the men who fired them were not Comanche. Evie saw them clearly. White men. They wore tattered bits of uniforms, dirty buckskins, and bandanas over their faces. They were shouting, their voices raw. "Take the horses, get the guns." It was not a Comanche war party. It was a gang of outlaws. "It is a trap," Chance Murphy bellowed, firing his own rifle at the ridge. He seemed almost angry. "It is white men. They are after the rifles." The narrow canyon was a trap. The soldiers had nowhere to go. Horses screamed and reared. Men were yelling, firing at shadows, their own bullets ricocheting off the stone. The driver, Harris, panicked. He stood up, lashing the mules with his whip. Get up! Get up!" "No," Evie screamed. "Get down! Stop!" It was too late. The heavy wagon lurched forward, one wheel striking a large boulder. The wagon tilted, groaned, and then tipped over, throwing Evie from the high seat. She did not scream. She felt a moment of weightlessness, a sense of falling. She hit the side of a steep, loose rock slope, and the world began to tumble. Red rock, blue sky, red rock, blue sky. She felt a dull, hard impact on the side of her head, and then nothing. The battle, if it could be called that, was a confused, desperate brawl. The outlaws had the high ground. Reed's soldiers, trapped on the canyon floor, were easy targets. One of the outlaws, a huge, bearded man, saw Evie's body lying crumpled on the slope. She was halfway down, unmoving, her skirt tangled around her legs. He grinned, his teeth black. He left his post, scrambling down the rocks, his rifle in one hand, a prize. Hawk had been too late. He had reached the canyon rim just as the first shot was fired. He watched, his heart like a stone. The soldiers were being cut to pieces. He thought, for a moment, that his prayers had been answered in a terrible way. Then he saw the attackers. They were white. White men killing white men. He did not understand. He saw Chance Murphy, fighting not like a man defending himself, but like a man betrayed, as if he knew these attackers. And then Hawk saw her, the girl from the crossing. She was lying on the rocks, unmoving. He saw the big outlaw, the one with the red beard, moving toward her. The man was laughing, reaching for her. Hawk made no sound. He was not a part of this fight. It was not his, but he had seen this man's eyes. He knew what he wanted. He had seen soldiers do the same to his cousin. He pulled an arrow from the quiver on his back. His hands were steady. He knocked the arrow, drew the string, and let it fly. He did not think. He only acted. The red-bearded man had just reached Evie. He was grabbing the front of her dress, starting to pull her. The arrow took him high in the back, punching through the leather vest with a sound like a fist hitting wet clay. The man stiffened. He looked down at the feathered shaft that had suddenly appeared from his chest. He made a soft, surprised sound, a sigh. He let go of Evie, staggered 2 steps, and then toppled face first onto the rocks. The fight was still raging below. No one had seen. The hawk was already moving. His horse, sure-footed as a goat, picked its way down a narrow game trail. He moved like smoke, silent and fast. Evie's head hurt, a dull, pounding ache. She heard the sound of the world, muffled, as if she were underwater. She forced her eyes open. The world was a blur of blue sky. She was moving. Someone was carrying her. She looked up. The face was like nothing she had ever seen. It was carved from the rock of the canyon itself, high cheekbones, a strong nose, and a long, healed scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. His eyes were black. Not brown, but black and deep, and they were looking at her with an intensity that stopped her breath. He was a Comanche, a warrior. He had saved her. No, he had captured her. She was in his arms, held against his chest, as he sat on his horse. She was terrified, but the arm around her waist was not cruel. It was strong, steady. She could feel the heat of his body through his leather shirt. She smelled horse and pine smoke and dust and the clean, wild scent of sage. His long, black hair, loose and caught by the wind, whipped across her face. It was softer than she would have thought. He spurred the horse, not back toward the fight, but toward a crack in the canyon wall, a shadow she had not even seen. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Her head swam, and the darkness rushed back in. Her last thought was of the impossible warmth of his arm, the arm of an enemy, holding her safe. Back in the canyon, Captain Reed was shouting, "Retreat, retreat, fall back." His men, what was left of them, grabbed the horses and scrambled back the way they had come, leaving the dead and the wrecked wagon behind. Chance Murphy and his surviving men were right behind them, their faces black with rage. When they were clear, Reed stopped, his chest heaving. He had lost 6 men. "They knew we were coming," he spat, looking at Murphy. "They were not Comanches." Murphy growled. "That was Jed Stone's gang. They must have heard about the rifles." "It does not matter," Reed said, his voice cold. He was already thinking, already spinning the story. It was an ambush. Savages! He looked back at the wrecked kitchen wagon. Where is the Blake girl Harris? The young driver was holding his arm, which was bleeding. She was thrown, Captain, down the rocks. I do not think she survived. Or he looked at the canyon. Or they took her. Reed nodded slowly. A grim, satisfied look came over his face. This was better. A dead girl was a tragedy. A live girl, taken by savages, that was a call to war. That was the fuel he needed. "They have taken her," he said, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "The Comanche, they ambushed us, and they took the white girl." He turned his horse. "We rode back. We will get more men. We will send a rider to Blake's Crossing. His daughter has been taken. Now, this territory will finally give me the army I need to burn them out for good." The first thing she felt was the pain, a dull, heavy throb behind her right eye that made the world a blurry. "Sick place," she groaned, a small sound that died in the stillness. She was lying on something soft but firm, a fur, smelling of dust and a faint, musky animal scent. The air was wrong. It was not the open, sharp wind of the prairie. It was still and close and smelled of smoke. Evelyn Blake forced her eyes open. The light was gray and thin, filtering through a high crack in a ceiling of rock. She was in a cave, not a large one. The stone walls were close, the ceiling low. A few feet away, a small, smokeless fire crackled, its light flickering on the rock. She turned her head, her muscles screaming in protest. He was there. He sat near the fire, his back to her. He was mending something, his broad shoulders hunched as he worked a piece of leather. Then he turned, and she saw his profile, the high cheekbones, the strong, straight nose, the long, black hair. It was the man from the ridge, the man from the fight, the Comanche. Fear, cold and pure, washed through her, clearing the fog from her head. She scrambled backward, a choked gasp tearing from her throat. Her back hit the cold, unforgiving stone of the cave wall. He did not move. He simply watched her, his hand, which held a small, sharp knife, resting on his knee. He was perfectly still, his black eyes unreadable in the dim light. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry croak. "Please, do not hurt me." He said nothing. He just looked at her, his gaze intense, assessing. He was a warrior. She saw that now. Lean and hard, with scars on his arms and the long, healed one that ran down the side of his face. He was everything she had been taught to fear. She tried to sit up straighter, pulling her legs under her, trying to make herself small. She was trapped. "I have no money," she stammered. He stood. Evie stopped breathing. He rose in one fluid motion, not like a man getting up, but like a predator uncoiling. He was tall, taller than her father, and he seemed to fill the small space with a dangerous energy. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying up to cover her face. She waited for the blow, for the knife. A full minute passed. Nothing, only the sound of the fire and the wind, a low moan from somewhere outside. She opened one eye. He had not moved toward her. He had walked to the small fire and picked up a water skin. He held it out. When she did not move, he tossed it. It landed on the fur at her feet with a soft thud. He spoke. His voice was a low, rough rumble, like rocks moving against each other. The English was thick, broken. "You're safe." He pointed a finger at her. "For now." Evie stared at the water skin. She was so thirsty. Her head throbbed. She looked back at him. He had sat down again by the fire, picking up his knife. But he was not looking at his job. He was watching her. She noticed, for the first time, that she was covered by a heavy buffalo robe. She reached up to her head. Where the pain was centered, a strip of cloth, a bandage, was tied around her temple. It was damp. She looked at her arms, which had been scraped and raw from the fall. They were clean, a dark green. Herbal paste had been spread over the raw skin. She looked at him. "Did you do this?" He grunted. It seemed to be his answer for everything. She drank the water. It was cool and tasted of stone. It was the best water she had ever had. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by a vast, aching confusion. She had been taught that his people were monsters, savages who killed and tortured. Chance Murphy's boasts. The fear in her father's eyes, the cold certainty in Captain Reed's. But this man had found her. He had cleaned her wounds. He had bandaged her. He had covered her with a warm robe. She looked at her dress. It was dirty and torn from the fall, but it was intact. He had not touched her. He had not harmed her. He had, by all accounts, saved her. He was still watching her. This white woman. He had killed the outlaw who was about to take her. He had pulled her from the rocks, thrown her onto his horse, and brought her here, to his secret place. It had been an impulse, a stupid one. He had seen the terror in her eyes, the terror of the hunted, and he had acted without thinking. Now, she was here, a white woman. They were a curse. They brought soldiers and broken treaties and death. His family was gone, burned in their lodge by men in blue uniforms, all because a white man had claimed his father stole a horse. He hated her. He hated her kind, but she was hurt, and she was alone, and she looked at him, not with the arrogance he expected, but with a deep, bottomless fear. He did not like that look. "Why?" she whispered, finding her voice again. "Why did you take me?" He looked away, toward the fire. "You fall," he said, the words clumsy. "Bad man. The man with the red beard he came from?" Hawk drew his finger across his throat. "He killed you, or worse. You shot him," she said, remembering the sudden, shocking violence. He nodded. "Once. I'll stop him. The others," Evie said, her mind racing. "Captain Reed! The soldiers! They think you attacked them. They think the Comanche attacked his face, which had been a mask of stone, darkened. White soldiers! Stupid! He pointed back in the direction of the crossing. He shot the boy. He shot the wagon. Big fire. Evie stared. He had seen. He knew. Yes, she whispered. Yes, he did. He shot Miguel. The shared knowledge hung in the air. A fragile, impossible thread. He was not the enemy she had been told, and she was not the enemy he knew. She remembered the old woman at the crossing. She remembered her mother's stories. She took a breath, a gamble. My mother, she said, her voice shaking. She knew some of your people. Years ago, they were prisoners. At the fort, she helped them. Hawk went completely still. His hand stopped moving. He turned his head, his black eyes narrowing, searching her face, trying to find the lie. She brought them medicine, Evie continued, the words tumbling out. And food. She was kind. Evie fumbled for the words her mother had taught her, words she had not spoken since she was a child. She was Tiano. She gave Itzina for the sick. He stared at her. He knew of this woman. The elders still spoke of her. The white woman with the kind eyes and the soft hands, who had brought water and cooling herbs when the soldiers gave them only rotten meat. The one who had wept when the old man died. Your mother, he said, the words slow, measured. She was good. A good heart. It was the first real connection, the first admission that they were both human. The tension in the cave eased, but did not vanish. It was replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion and hunger. Evie's stomach, unaware of the delicate truce, chose that moment to rumble, a loud, desperate, gurgling sound that echoed in the quiet cave. She froze. Her entire body became rigid with embarrassment. She was a captive, in a cave with a man she was supposed to fear for her life, and her stomach was complaining. A hot, dark blush crept up her neck, flooding her face. She put her hands over her stomach, as if to quiet it. Hawk heard it. He looked at her, his face unreadable. Evie could not look at him. She stared at the fur robe, her hair falling over her face. She had to do something. She could not just be a trembling, useless victim. She was a cook. She was a worker. She was not a prize to be fought over. She found herself looking at the fire, at the small pile of dried meat, jerky, on a rock nearby. He had not touched it. Her voice was a dry whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, speaking to the floor. She took a shaky breath. I can cook. The silence that followed was absolute. She finally, slowly, raised her eyes. He was staring at her as if she had just announced she could fly. His mouth was parted, his eyes wide with a look of pure, blank astonishment. And then, the impossible happened. The scar on his cheek moved. The corner of his mouth twitched. His eyes, those hard, black eyes, crinkled. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of a smile. A thing that had not been used in a very long time and had forgotten how. He found the idea of this white girl, in her torn dress, offering to cook in his secret hiding place, to be the most absurd thing he had ever heard. You cook, he repeated, the words sounding strange in his mouth. Yes, she said, finding a tiny spark of her old self. I am a good cook. I cook at my father's place. I make bread and stew. And he held up a hand, silencing her. The ghost smile vanished, but the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of something. Curiosity. He rose, again. That silent, fluid motion. He went to a dark corner of the cave and moved a flat stone. From a hollow beneath it, he pulled a small, worn leather pouch. He walked back and dropped it in her lap. It was cornmeal. He pointed to the pouch, then to the strips of jerky, then to the water skin. Cook, he said. It was a command, but it was also a challenge. Evie looked at the pouch, at the fire. She was in his world now, but this was something she knew. She untied the pouch. I need a pot or a pan. He gave her a look of mild scorn. He picked up a large, flat, clean stone and, with a stick, settled it on the edge of the coals. Of course, she felt foolish. She poured some of the cornmeal into her hand, added a few drops of water, and began to work it into a stiff paste. Her hands were shaking. She tried to move the stone, to make it hotter, but it was heavy. No, his voice was on her shoulder. She jumped, a small cry escaping her. He was right behind her, kneeling. She was trapped between his body and the fire. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, from the stones. He smelled of sage and wind. He did not touch her. He pointed. "This wood, it burns too fast." His hand brushed hers as he reached for a thicker, harder piece of wood from his small pile. He settled it onto the coals. Slow, for stone. He showed her how to arrange the small, hot coals around the base of the rock. His movements were precise, economical. She turned back to the dough. He took his knife, the one that had terrified her, and in a few swift motions, he sliced the tough jerky into paper-thin strips. He handed them to her. She mixed the meat into the cornmeal, formed small, flat cakes, and laid them on the hot stone. A new smell began to fill the cave. It was not the musky smell of hides, or the sharp smell of old smoke. It was the rich, warm, comforting scent of toasting corn and roasting meat. It was the smell of home. Evie felt a hot sting behind her eyes. It was so normal, so human. Hawk sat back on his heels, watching the cakes brown. It had been years since he had smelled anything so good. He had forgotten. He had lived on jerky and roots, on meat roasted quickly on a stick and eaten in hiding. This was different. He looked at her. Her face was smudged with soot. Her hair was tangled. She was watching the food with a fierce, desperate concentration. He spoke, his voice so low she almost did not hear it. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire. "Stay," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Evie's head snapped up. "What stay?" he repeated. He seemed to be searching for the words, pulling them from a place he had buried long ago. "I need you more than air." Evie's heart did a strange, painful flip. It was a joke. It had to be. He was mocking her. But his face, visible only in profile, was not mocking. He was not talking about her. He was talking about the smell, the warmth, the food. He was talking about the end of loneliness. A dark, slow blush crept up her neck, warming her face. She looked down, her heart pounding a heavy, slow rhythm against her ribs. When the cakes were dark and crispy, she used a stick to push one onto a small, clean rock. She slid it toward him. He looked at the cake. He looked at her. He took it. She pushed one onto a rock for herself. They ate in silence. The cake was hot, salty, and smoky. It was, Evie thought, the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. He ate two. She ate two. There was one left. He pushed it toward her. She shook her head and pushed it back. He looked at her for a long second. Then, with his knife, he broke it in half and slid the larger piece back to her. She ate. He ate. She looked at him over the fire. His eyes met hers. The hardness was still there. He was a warrior. He was her captor. But the cold, empty hatred was gone. He was just a man who was hungry. And she realized, with a sudden, dizzying lurch, that she was not afraid, not right now. She was wary. She was trapped, but she was not afraid of him. As the last of the light faded from the crack in the ceiling, a new sound began. It was not the low moan of the wind. It was a high, thin hiss. Hawk's head came up. He was instantly tense. All traces of the shared meal gone. "What is it?" she whispered. He did not answer. He rose and went to the narrow entrance of the cave, which was covered by a heavy, hanging hide. He pushed it aside. A furious blast of wind and sand shot into the cave, making the fire gutter and spark violently. Evie cried out, covering her face. Hawk dropped the hide, his body blocking the opening as it fell. The sound of the wind was a scream. Sandstorm. He said, the one word was absolute. "We stay. Many days. Maybe." The wind howled, a rising, furious shriek. The small cave was now their entire world. The fire, though small, was the only warmth. As the night wore on, the stone floor grew colder, pulling the heat from Evie's body. She wrapped herself in the buffalo robe, but she could not stop shivering. Hawk watched her from across the fire. He had his own blanket, a thinner wool one. He got up. Evie tensed, watching him move in the flickering light. He walked over and threw his blanket on top of her. "You," She started. "You will be cold." "I am fine," he said, his voice flat. He went to the farthest, darkest corner of the cave, as far from her as he could get. He sat with his back to her, his arms wrapped around his knees. He was a rigid, silent silhouette. Evie lay under the heavy weight of the two blankets, the fur and his wool blanket. She was warm, but she could hear, over the rising shriek of the wind, the faint, uncontrollable sound of his teeth chattering. She lay there in the dark, her heart pounding, her body warm from his blanket, and listened to her captor shiver. She felt nothing but a vast, terrible, and complete confusion. The sandstorm was a living thing. It screamed for 2 days and 2 nights, a solid wall of yellow grit that turned the world beyond the cave mouth into a roaring, blind chaos. Inside the small stone pocket, they were prisoners. The world shrank to the circle of firelight, the sound of the wind, and the presence of the other. Time blurred. They settled into a strange, silent routine, a life that had no past or future. Only the pressing now. Evie, to keep from going mad, took control of the small space. She was a woman who knew work, and work was her shield. She swept the floor with a branch of sagebrush Hawk had in his supplies, the sharp, clean smell cutting through the closeness. She organized the small pile of provisions, the cornmeal, the dried meat, a handful of bitter roots, a skin of water. He watched her. He sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, restringing his bow, his hands never idle, but his eyes followed her. He saw how she moved, with a quiet, determined efficiency, as if this cave were her own kitchen. On the second day, she saw the cut on his hand. It was a long, shallow gash on his left forearm, red and angry, that he had gotten during the fight in the canyon and had ignored. He had wrapped it in a dirty piece of rawhide. He was checking his horse, which was tethered in a deeper, darker part of the cave. When she approached him, he did not hear her. She was learning to move quietly. "That," she said, her voice making him jump, his hand flying to the knife at his hip. He spun, his eyes fierce. "Do not," she said, holding up her hands. "Your arm. It is bad." He looked at the gash as if he had forgotten it was there. He just grunted and turned back to the horse. "It will go poison," she said, her voice stronger. "If it gets sick, you will lose the arm. My mother taught me." He stopped. He looked at her. His eyes narrowed. "I have water. And the fire. If you let me clean it, I have a needle." She showed him the small sewing kit she had in the bag from the wagon. He stared at her for a long time. Trusting a white person with a needle and a wound was a fool's act. But he had seen the wound. He knew it was festering. And he remembered her words about her mother. Slowly, deliberately, he sat on a rock and held out his arm. Her hands trembled. This was a line, a strange, new line. She put a pot of water on the fire to boil. She unwrapped the filthy raw hide, her stomach turning at the smell. The cut was deep, the edges puckered and red. "This will hurt," she said. "I know pain," he said, his voice flat. She tore a strip from her spare petticoat, the only clean cloth she had. She dipped it in the hot water. He did not wince when she touched the wound. He did not make a sound as she cleaned the grit and dried blood away, his muscles like stone under her fingers. She took her needle, held it in the fire until it glowed red, and let it cool. "I have to," she pointed. "Close it." He nodded. She stitched the wound. Her work was small, neat, and professional. Her mother had taught her well. He watched her face as she worked. She was biting her lower lip, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was not a captive. She was not a victim. She was a woman doing a job. When she was finished, she searched for something to bandage it. He reached into his own pack and pulled out a small pouch. He handed it to her. It was full of a dark green, pungent moss. "Keep the sickness out," he said. She packed the moss into the wound, as he had known she would, and then wrapped it with the last of her clean cloth. She sat back on her heels. "There." He looked at the clean white bandage. He looked at her. He said nothing, but he flexed his hand, and the pain was already less. That night, as the wind howled, The silence between them was different. It was not empty. "She is my mother," Evie said, her voice small, staring into the fire. She was the one they called a traitor. Hawk was carving a piece of wood, but his hands stilled. "She used to tell me that there was only one kind of person, the kind who hurts and the kind who helps. She did not see color." Evie's voice was bitter. "She helped everyone. She set a broken leg for a drifter everyone said was an outlaw. She took food to the Comanche prisoners at the fort, the ones you spoke of. She did it in secret, at night, but they found out. She pulled her knees to her chest. They stopped talking to her. The women in town, they would cross the street. They said she was unclean, arid lover. My father told her to stop. He was afraid of losing the post, of what people would say. She did not stop." Hawk said. "It was not a question." "No," Evie whispered. "She did not, but she got quieter. She stopped singing in the kitchen. She just faded. When the fever came that winter, she did not fight it. She just let go. The doctor said it was the fever, but I know she died because they isolated her. She died of a broken heart, for being kind." Hawk stopped carving. He looked at his own hand, at the white bandage she had put there. "My mother," he said, his voice low and rough. "She was also kind. Too kind. She believed a white man. A trader. He said he would trade fairly. He came to our camp. He ate our food. He smiled at the children. Then he left. And 2 days later, the soldiers came. He had told them where we were. For whiskey." He was silent, the memory a shadow on his face. "They burned our camp. She was not fast enough. I found her. She was killed for her kindness." Evie looked at him, at the long scar on his face. She saw the small, hidden boy who had found his mother. She felt a terrible, aching kinship. Two people, in a cave, orphans of kindness in a world that did not reward it. The storm lasted one more day. The wind finally died in the night, leaving a great, ringing silence. The next morning, the air was clear and cold. The world scoured clean. Hawk went out, moving like a shadow. He returned 2 hours later, his face grim. "Soldiers," he said. "They ride patrols. They look for me. They look for you." The truce was over. The world had returned. Evie felt the fear rush back, cold and sharp. "What will we do?" He did not answer. He was busy. He was teaching her. He took her outside, into the small, hidden box canyon where the cave was. He showed her how to tie a knot that would not slip. He made her do it, over and over, until her clumsy fingers got it right. "A bad knot," he said, his voice hard. "You fall, you die." He showed her how to make a fire in the wind, using a small spark, a bit of dried moss, and a curved piece of bark to shield it. He made her taste the difference between two roots. This one, food. This one, sleeps. Forever. He was harsh, impatient, but he was teaching her. Then, one afternoon, as she was practicing, a hawk cried out, high above the canyon. Evie looked up, shielding her eyes. "It is beautiful, the name your mother gave you." He was looking at the sky, his face unreadable. "Takani." She tried to say it. "Tiakani." The sound that came out was wrong, her tongue clumsy. He looked at her. The ghost of a smile returned, playing in his mouth. "No, Takani, from here." He touched his throat. "Takani," she tried again. It was worse. And then he did it. He laughed. It was not a smile. It was a real, short bark of a laugh. A sound so rusty and unused it seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Evie stared, and then she smiled. "Well, I will keep trying." The laugh, the small, shared lessons, it was a fragile piece, and it was shattered the next day. Hawk was on the ridge above the cave, scouting. When he heard the horses, not soldiers, he knew the sound. Comanche. He dropped down, silent, and waited. 3 riders appeared. The one in the lead, Red Elk, was a man Hawk knew, a man he did not trust. Red Elk was a hardliner, a warrior who believed all white people were snakes, all compromising a weakness. Red Elk saw the tracks near the cave. He dismounted, his face a mask of suspicion. "You are far from the camp." "Takani," Red Elk said. his eyes flicking to the hidden cave entrance. "And you are alone? Or are you?" Before Hawk could answer, Evie, who had heard the voices, pushed aside the hide. She stood in the mouth of the cave, her face pale, her eyes wide. Red Elk's hand went to his knife. "A white woman," he hissed. "You have taken a white woman. Have you lost your mind? She is the reason the soldiers are riding. She is nothing," another warrior said, raising his rifle. "Let me kill her. It will end the trouble." No, Hawk moved. So fast he was a blur, and stood between Evie and the warriors. He was not a man now. He was a warrior, in his own land, and his voice was the sound of the canyon itself. "She is a guest," he said, the Comanche words sharp and clear. "She is a guest in my canyon. You will not harm her," Guest Red Elk sneered. "She is a plague. She is the excuse they use. Give her to us, Takani. We will give her back to the soldiers. In pieces. It will be a message." "You will not touch her," Hawk repeated, his hand on his own knife. The air was electric. "Stop." The voice was quiet, but it had the weight of years. An older man, who had been riding with Red Elk, stepped forward. He was an elder, one of the council. He looked at Hawk. He looked at Evie, his eyes sharp and assessing. He saw the bandage on Hawk's arm, the white, clean cloth. "We will speak of this," the elder said, his gaze returning to Red Elk. "Later. We do not fight each other while the soldiers hunt us. We will hear Takani's story." At the council, Red Elk sheathed his knife, his eyes still burning with hatred. He looked at Evie. "This is not over, white girl." He spat in broken English. Then they mounted and rode away. The silence that was left was worse than the confrontation. That night, the world changed again. The air, which had been clear, turned cold, a deep, biting cold that came down from the mountains. The storm had broken the heat, but this was a new, dangerous thing. They built up the fire, but the small cave was stone, and the stone was cold. They ate their small meal in silence. The threat from Red Elk was a new shadow in the cave. Evie wrapped herself in the buffalo robe, but the cold was a physical thing, a weight. It crept into her bones. She began to shiver. Across the fire, Hawk was wrapped in his wool blanket, but he was shivering, too, for hours. They stayed apart, two shivering, miserable islands. This was not discomfort. This was becoming dangerous. Finally, Hawk stood. He walked over to her. She looked up, her teeth chattering. He did not speak. He just sat down behind her, his back to her, and pushed his back against hers. "What are you doing, Warmth?" he growled. "We will freeze, like this. We share." They sat back to back, 2 points of resistance, giving their warmth to each other. It was better. The shivering did not stop, but it eased. They sat like that for another hour, the fire dying to embers. "It was not enough. It is not working," Evie whispered. Her toes were numb. He made a low, frustrated sound. He turned around. He was facing her back. Before she could react, he pulled her back against his chest. He was long and hard, and he wrapped his arms around her, pulling the buffalo robe and his wool blanket over both of them. Evie went rigid. She was in his arms. His chest was at her back. His legs were against hers. His breath was warm on her neck. One of his arms was like an iron bar across her waist, holding the blankets down. "Be still," he ordered, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "It is to live. Only this." She was still. She was terrified, but as the seconds ticked by, she did not feel threatened. He was not touching her. He was holding her. His hand, the one with the bandage she had tied, rested on her arm, just above the elbow. It was rough, calloused, but it was just there. It was not gentle. It was not cruel. It was a fact, and it was warm, a slow, creeping, profound warmth. It started where his chest met her back and spread, pushing the deadly cold away. Her shivering began to ease. She let out a breath she did not know she was holding. His chin was resting on the top of her head. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her spine. They lay in the dark. Two enemies, closer than lovers. "I used to be afraid of the dark," Evie whispered, the word surprising her. When I was a girl, I thought monsters were under the bed. He was silent for a long time. She thought he was asleep. I am not afraid of the dark, he finally whispered. His voice so low she felt it more than heard it. The dark is safe. I'm afraid of deep water. I cannot swim. She held on to that, a small, human confession. A warrior who could face soldiers and bears, but who was afraid of water. She did not know when she fell asleep. She only knew that she woke up, and she was warm. And she was alive. When the first thin gray light of dawn filled the cave, they untangled themselves without a word. The intimacy of the night was a wall of awkwardness between them. Hawk rose and went to the cave mouth. The air was cold, but clear. The world was sharp and new. He turned to her. His face was a mask again. The warrior, the captor, the man who had laughed, the man who had shivered, was gone. The storm is over, he said, his voice flat. The patrols are out, but the way is clear for now. He gathered his things, his movement swift. I will take you to the ridge. You can see your home from there. Evie stood, her heart a cold stone. You are letting me go. He looked at her, his black eyes unreadable. You go back, he said, to your father, to your people. He slung his bow over his shoulder. He did not look at her as he said the last words. Or you accept a harder path. He did not say what that path was. He did. He just walked out of the cave, into the cool morning light, leaving her to follow. She stood for a moment, the buffalo robe at her feet. He had given her a choice. Go back to the world that had betrayed her. The world that had lied, the world that had taken her father, or what stay with him, a man of a hunted people, be an outcast, a traitor. For real this time, she did not know why, but the single, unfinished word, caused her more pain than anything that had happened yet. The ride from the cave was silent. The world, washed clean by the storm, felt too bright, too open. The intimacy of the dark, cold night was gone, shattered by the sharp morning light. They were not two people surviving. They were a Comanche warrior and a white woman, and the space between their horses felt a mile wide. He led her through a series of dry arroyos and hidden game trails, a path no soldier would ever find. He moved with a confident, silent economy, his horse a part of him. Evie followed, her own heart a dull, heavy ache. She was going back. She had to, but the thought of Blake's crossing, of the smoke-filled saloon and her father's weak eyes, felt like a noose. The cave, which had been a prison, now seemed, in her memory, like a strange, hard sanctuary. After an hour, he stopped. They were on a high, flat mesa, and there, below them, small and vulnerable in the vast prairie, was the crossing, the huddle of buildings, the muddy line of the creek. She could see a plume of smoke from the kitchen chimney. You go from here, Hawk said. He did not look at her. He looked at the post, his face hard, his eyes full of a familiar hatred. They will see you. They will not see me. She turned in her saddle. This was it, the choice. He had said, a harder path. But he was not offering it. He was sending her back. Hawk, she began, her voice small. He turned his head. His black eyes met hers. She wanted to say, I want to stay. She wanted to say, I do not belong there, any more than you do. She wanted to say, they are liars and killers. But she thought of her father, old and broken. She thought of Maggie. It was her duty, her prison. Thank you, she whispered. It was so small, so stupid. For the bandage, for saving me. He just nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. He understood, better than she did, how useless the word thank you was between their two worlds. She slipped off the horse, her legs unsteady. She stood for a moment, her bag in her hand, the wind whipping her tangled hair across her face. They will hunt you, she said. Read. He will not stop. Let him come, Hawk said, his voice flat. He is a fool. He sees what he wants to see. She wanted to touch him. She had stitched his skin. She had shared his breath in the cold. But now he was a stranger, a warrior on a horse, and she was just a white girl in a torn dress. She settled for touching his arm. Just a brief, light brush of her fingers against the leather of his sleeve. His reaction was immediate. He did not pull away. His hand came down and caught hers. His hand was rough, calloused, and hot. It closed around her smaller, softer one, and he held it. He did not squeeze. He did not caress. He just held it. He held it for a long, heavy second. Then another. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a brief, assessing touch, as if memorizing the shape of her bones. Then he let her go. So suddenly, it felt like a slap. "Go," he said, his voice rough. He turned his horse in a single, fluid motion, his back to her. He would not watch her leave. Evie swallowed the hard lump in her throat. She turned, and with her head down, she began the long, lonely walk down the slope, back to the world that was waiting to swallow her. She was halfway there, in the open, flat ground, when she heard the shout, "By God! Look, it is her, she is alive." Evie stopped, her heart seizing. A group of riders, maybe a dozen, were sweeping in from the east. They were not soldiers. They were the men from the saloon, the hard cases, the drifters. And at their lead, on his big gray horse, was Chance Murphy. He spurred his horse, kicking up a plume of dirt, and reined in so hard the animal reared, its front hooves flashing. Murphy stared down at her, his eyes, small and greedy, raking over her. He saw the torn dress, the dirt smudges, the bandage on her head. "Well, look who is back from the play party," he sneered, his voice loud for the other men to hear. His face was not full of relief. It was full of a strange, dark rage, as if a piece of property had been stolen and then returned, damaged. "Where you been?" "Girl," he spat, dropping a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Been keeping that Buck's lodge warm for him. She has been with them," another man yelled. "Riding up. Look at her. She is filthy. She is ruined. She has been sleeping with the Comanche. She is their woman now." Evie shrank back, her hands flying up as if to ward off the words. She had faced a sandstorm and a warrior. But this wall of hate from her own people made her want to vomit. A second group of riders arrived. This time, it was Captain Nathan Reed, at the head of 5 soldiers, and behind him, on his old mare, his face as gray as the ash in a cold fireplace, was her father. "Evelyn," Thomas Blake cried out, his voice a choked, broken sound. He half fell from his horse, stumbling toward her. "My God, Evie, you are alive." He grabbed her, pulling her into a hug so tight it hurt. For 1 second, she felt a wave of relief. She was home. She was safe. But then, as he held her, he was also pushing her, turning her away from the other men, trying to hide her. She could feel him trembling. He was relieved, but he was also, already, deeply ashamed. Captain Reed dismounted, his boots polished, his uniform clean. He did not approach Evie. He stood back, assessing her, his cold eyes taking in every detail. He was not looking at a lost girl. He was looking at a piece of evidence. "Thomas," Reed said, his voice crisp, "take her inside. She must be cleansed." The men were gathering, forming a tight, angry circle. "What did they do to you, girl?" one of them demanded. "Did they use you?" "No," Evie cried out, her voice finally tearing loose. She was not the same girl who had left. She was not a proper girl. She was angry. "No, you are wrong, all of you." The sudden silence was deafening. "It was not the Comanche," she said, her voice shaking but getting stronger. She looked at Reed, at her father, at the hard, hateful faces. "We were in the canyon. It was an ambush. It was outlaws, white men like I like him." She pointed at Chance Murphy. A low, dangerous murmur went through the crowd. This was not the story they had been told. This was not the story they wanted. They killed the soldiers. "They were going to take me, to kill me." Her voice cracked. "A Comanche warrior. He saved me. He saved my life, Chance." Murphy let out a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "Saved you, is that what he called it? Did he save you all night long? Girl, did he save you good and proper?" "She is lying," the man who had ridden with Murphy shouted. "She is a Comanche lover." Quiet Reed's voice cut through the noise like a whip. He walked forward, his face a mask of profound, false pity. He stopped in front of Evie, close enough that she could smell the leather of his gloves. "Miss Blake," he said, his voice soft, but carrying to every man. "You have been through a terrible, terrible ordeal." "It is the truth," she insisted, her eyes flashing. Reed shook his head slowly, sadly. "The poor girl," he said to the crowd. "She is confused. She is hysterical. Her mind has been twisted by the ordeal, the shock." He turned back to her, his voice hardening. "Miss Blake, we are not fools. We know what happened. You were taken. You were held in a savage's den. It is a terrible thing, what they did to your mind." He tapped his own temple. "You are sick. You are a fantasist. Girl, lost in cheap novels. They have filled your head with lies." "I am not lying," she screamed. "Perhaps," Reed said, his voice silky. "You went with him willingly. Perhaps you found the company agreeable." "No." Thomas Blake grabbed her arm. "Hush, Evie. For God's sake, hush. Get her inside." "Thomas," Reed commanded. "She must be isolated. For her own good. She is corrupted. Her father," his face a mask of shame, pulled her toward the saloon. The men parted for them, their faces a mix of disgust and pity. The main room was dark after the bright sun. Maggie O'Reilly was there, her hands white with flour. She saw Evie, and her face went pale. "Oh, child," Maggie whispered, rushing forward. "What did they do to you? Leave her alone," Thomas Blake yelled, shoving past her. "She has caused enough trouble." "Maggie," Evie pleaded, grabbing the older woman's arm. "He was kind. He saved me." The men from the posse were crowding in behind her, filling the saloon, their boots scraping on the floor. "Shame on you all," Maggie cried, her Irish temper flaring. She stood between Evie and the men. "Can you not see she is hurt? She is not a piece of meat. She is a child. Leave her be. Shut up, woman." Chance Murphy growled from the doorway. "This is men's business." "She is right that you should leave her," Reed said, stepping into the room. He dominated it. "She needs to be left, but the business is just beginning." Evie looked at the faces. The drovers, the freighters, the soldiers. They were not looking at her as Evie. They were looking at her as a thing that had been broken by the enemy, a thing that justified their hate. She realized, with a sickening cold clarity, that her truth did not matter. It was a tiny, fragile thing, and their hate was a boulder. They did not want her to be saved by a Comanche. They needed her to be ruined by one. It made their anger simple. It made their violence righteous. Reed saw his moment. He stepped up onto the small stair that led to the rooms. He was above them now. "We have all heard it," he said, his voice ringing. "We heard it from her own lips." A Comanche warrior. She admits it. She was in their den, a den where they took her, where they corrupted her. A low, animal growl rose from the men. "Let's burn him out. Let's get the man who did it. I am forming a militia," Reed declared, his hand on his pistol. "A citizen's patrol. We will ride to that den. We will find the savages who held this girl, and we will clean it out. We will rescue the honor of this territory." A roar of approval. The men raised their glasses, their rifles. And then, in the silence that followed, Reed turned. He looked down at Thomas Blake, who stood trembling behind his own bar. "Thomas," Reed said, his voice quiet. "Deadly, you are the girl's father. Your name has been dishonored here today. Your daughter's honor must be avenged." Evie's head snapped up. She looked at her father. His face was slick with sweat. "Pa," she whispered. "No, tell them. Tell them what I said. Tell them the truth." Thomas Blake looked at his daughter, his eyes full of a terrible, bottomless agony. He saw her, his only child, pleading for him. Then he looked at Reed. He looked at the 30 angry men in his saloon. He looked at his bottles, his bar, the small, miserable life he had built. He knew that if he said no, if he took her side against them, he would be finished. They would call him a red lover, just as they had called his wife. They would burn his place to the ground. He was a weak man. He had been a weak man all his life. "Pa, please," Evie begged. He made his choice. He turned his back on Evie. He looked up at Captain Reed. He swallowed. He nodded. "Whiskey," he said, his voice a dry croak. "For the men, on the house." He grabbed a bottle, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "We will do what must be done." Evie made a sound, a small, choking sound. It was not a cry. It was the sound of something inside her breaking. The final betrayal. Her father. He had chosen his bar over her. He had chosen the lie. "Get her to her room," Thomas said, his voice suddenly harsh, brutal, to cover his own shame. "And lock the door. You have caused enough trouble. You will stay there until you are right in the head again." He grabbed her arm and dragged her up the stairs, ignoring her protests. He shoved her into her small, airless room and slammed the door. She heard the sound of the key turning in the lock. She was a prisoner. She stood in the middle of the room, her body numb, her mind reeling. She was home. She was safe. She was locked in. She stumbled to the window, the same window she had stood at just a few nights ago, watching the man on the ridge. The sun was setting. The sky was turning that deep, painful purple. The prairie was a sea of shadow. And then she saw it, far away, on the high ridge, the one he had taken her to. A tiny spark, a flicker of orange, a fire. He was there. He was watching. He had not abandoned her. He was waiting. He was watching to make sure she got home safe. The irony was so bitter it choked her. He was out there, alone, cold, and hunted. But he was free. He was the only one in this whole, dark world who knew the truth. And she was here. Safe. Home. Locked in a room by the father who had just sold her. Surrounded by men who wanted to use her as an excuse to kill. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, her fingers spreading, as if she could reach across the miles of darkness. The fire was so small, so far away. "Please," she whispered to the glass, "to the distant, lonely light. Be safe." Hawk did not wait for the sun. The tiny fire on the ridge had burned down to embers, but the image of her, walking back into that den of liars, was seared into his mind. He had watched her go. He had kept his promise. He was not a fool. He knew Reed. He knew the type. Men who saw the world as a map to be redrawn in their own image, and anything that stood in the way a tree, a river, a people was simply an obstacle to be removed. The girl, her truth, was the most dangerous obstacle of all. His scouts found him before the moon was high. They were two, shadows who had slipped past Reed's drunken patrols. Their news was a knife in his gut. They ride at dawn. "Takani," the lead scout whispered, his face grim. "Red Elk's people saw the tracks. The soldiers are gathering. They use the girl's name. They say she was taken. They use it as the word for war." Where Hawk asked, his voice flat. "The Red Willow camp." Hawk's blood froze. Red Willow. It was not a war camp. It was where the women, and the children were. A place of medicine and safety. A place his own mother had loved. "They know," Hawk said. "They know it is a place for women. They ride," the scout said. His words a death sentence. To avenge the white girl. He knew. Reed was not just going to war. He was going to a massacre. And he was using Evie's return as the spark. He was twisting her rescue into a violation. The conflict was absolute. His people, the women and children in that valley, helpless. He had to go. He had to warn them. But her, the girl in the locked room, they were using her. And Reed was smart. He would not leave a witness who knew the truth. "They will kill her," Hawk said, the realization hitting him. They would ride to the camp, commit their murders, and they would say the savages had killed her in the fight. Or they would do it themselves and blame his people. She was at a loose end, and Reed was a man who tied up his loose ends. He was torn. His people, the girl, his people, the girl who had stitched his arm and shared his breath. He could not be in two places. He could not save both, unless— "You," he said to his scouts. "Ride. Ride to the Red Willow. Take the high path. Tell the elder to run. Take them to the high caves. Go now. And you? Takani, I am a ghost, Hawk said. I have to stop the story. He did not know what he meant. He only knew he could not let Reed have his lie. He had to know the real plan, the exact time. He had to break the machine before it started. He gave his horse to the scouts. They vanished into the night. On foot, he was slower, but he was also invisible. He moved toward Blake's crossing, a shadow moving through other shadows. The land was his ally. He knew every dip, every wash, every patch of bare stone that would not hold a print. The crossing was not asleep. It was a war camp. Lanterns burned. Drunk men, deputized by Reed, walked sloppy patrols, their rifles in their hands, their mouths full of boasts. They were hunters, not soldiers. They were loud. They were stupid. They made it easy. He skirted the main house, listening to the roar of voices from the saloon. He moved toward the back, toward the stables. It was the softest part of the post. The stable door was not latched. He slipped inside. The air was thick with the warm, dark smells of horse, old hay, and manure. A few horses snorted in their stalls as he passed. He whispered to them, a low, soft sound, and they quieted. In the back, in the darkness, he heard a low voice. He froze. It was Chance Murphy. He was not talking to anyone. He was alone, in an empty stall, with a bottle. He was running his thumb over the edge of his long skinning knife, his eyes gleaming in a sliver of moonlight from a high window. Tomorrow, Murphy was whispering to himself, a love song to his blade. Tomorrow, we get paid. Paid in gold, paid in hair. So much hair. Pretty, pretty hair. Hawk felt a cold, clean rage. A sound behind him, a heavy boot heel scuffing the dirt floor. A drunk soldier stumbled in from the main yard, fumbling with the buttons on his trousers. He was looking for a dark corner to relieve himself. He saw Hawk's shadow. Who is that? The soldier slurred, squinting. Hawk moved. He was not a man. He was a force. Before the soldier could draw a breath, Hawk's hand was over his mouth, stifling the cry. His other arm was a bar across the man's chest. He did not kill him. He slammed the soldier's head. Once, hard, against the heavy oak post of the stall. The man's eyes rolled back, and he went limp. Hawk caught him, eased him to the ground. He dragged the unconscious man into the stall Murphy had just left, threw him in the corner, and covered him with a pile of dirty, old hay. He had minutes, maybe less. He needed to hear Reed. He moved to the back wall of the stable, the wall that joined the main house. A loft, used for storing hay, ran above him. From there, a small window looked out, over the kitchen roof, and into the back window of the saloon's private room. Reed's office. He climbed, silent as a spider, and settled himself in the hay. He could see them. Reed and Chance Murphy. They were standing over a map on the table. A lantern lit their faces. Reed's was cold and precise. Murphy's was flushed, greedy. It is perfect, Reed was saying, his finger tapping the map. We ride at first light, 4 o'clock. We will be at the Red Willow by 7. They will still be asleep. My men are ready, Murphy growled, his voice thick with whiskey. We will get the warrior who took the girl. Reed looked at him, his eyes full of a cold contempt. You are a fool. Murphy, we are not getting a warrior. We are getting rid of all of them. No survivors. Do you understand me? None. We burn the camp. We leave nothing. It is the only way to send a message. What about the girl? Murphy asked. Reed smiled, a thin, terrible motion of his lips. The girl. She has become inconvenient, hysterical. She knows what happened in the canyon. She keeps telling her story. It is a loose end. He leaned in, his voice a low, poison whisper that carried clearly in the night air. We will ride in, firing, in the confusion. With bullets flying, accidents happen. It would be a tragedy if she were hit by a stray bullet. A Comanche bullet, of course. He smiled. It would only seal their fate. The animals, murdering a white woman. After everything, it will be the final piece of the story. Murphy's grin showed his brown teeth. I like that. Clean. No one will question us then. No one. Reed agreed. Hawk's blood ran cold. He had been right. Reed was going to murder the entire camp. and then murder Evie to cover his tracks. He was a dead man. He had to get out. He had to warn the camp himself. He turned to go, and then he heard it. A scrape. Not from below, but from outside. From the roof. He froze in the hayloft. He heard a scrambling sound. A low, desperate grunt. And then, with a sound like a sack of potatoes, something heavy and soft hit the kitchen roof just below his window. He saw a shadow, a figure, climbing down from an upstairs window. Evie. She was locked in her room, and she was listening. Downstairs, the saloon was a roaring pit of hate. The men were drinking her father's whiskey, shouting, their voices full of violence, to the girl they toasted, to avenge her and through the thin floorboards. She had heard her father's voice, a high, strained, terrible sound, agreeing with them. Yes, yes, we will avenge her. She had heard enough. She was not a sacrifice. She was not an excuse. She had gone to her window. It was old, it was warped, but her hands, made strong by a lifetime of hard work, were not weak. She had found her mother's sewing scissors. She jammed the steel tip into the frame, prying, pushing, her knuckles bleeding. She did not care. The old wood groaned, and then, with a crack, it gave. She pushed the window open. The night air was a cold slap. The drop was 2 stories. Impossible. But below her was the low, sloping roof of the kitchen. It was still a 10-foot drop. She did not hesitate. She climbed out, her skirt catching on a nail, tearing with a loud rip. She hung from the windowsill for a second, her feet finding the wall, and then she let go. She hit the shingled roof hard, the impact knocking the breath from her. She slid, gasping, unable to stop herself, her nails clawing at the wood. She slid off the edge. It was a shorter drop this time, maybe 6 feet. She landed in the mud and muck behind the kitchen, the fall jarring her to her teeth. But she was up in a second. She was free, and she was trapped. The yard was full of drunk, armed men. She needed to hide. She needed to think. The stable, the darkest, safest place. She slipped from the shadows of the house and ran. A ghost, across the open ground. She pulled the heavy stable door open, just a crack, and slid inside. She stood, her heart pounding so hard it felt like a fist in her throat. The darkness was absolute. It smelled of hay, and it smelled of someone. A hand, hard, calloused, smelling of smoke. It clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream. An arm, like a band of steel, wrapped around her waist, lifted her from her feet, and dragged her backward, into the deep, black shadow of an empty stall. She fought, she bit, she kicked. It was one of Reed's men. He was going to... A voice, a hiss. It was in her ear, a rough whisper that was more impossible than the men outside. Be still. She froze. Her body went rigid. She knew that voice. She knew the feel of that arm. She stopped fighting. The hand over her mouth did not move, but the pressure eased. She turned her head, her cheek pressing into his rough, warm hand. She could not speak. She could only stare into the darkness where his face was. And then they heard it. Boots. Heavy, on the dirt floor. I heard something. A voice slurred. A lantern beam, yellow and unsteady, sliced through the darkness. Hawk pulled her down. He did not let her go. He fell with her, pulling her onto the hay-covered floor, behind a low water trough. He covered her body with his own, pressing her flat, his weight a sudden, hard, protective thing. His hand was still over her mouth. Check the stalls, the man ordered. The light came closer. Evie could see the dust motes dancing in the beam. She could feel Hawk's heart, a steady, powerful thud, thud, thud against her back. He was not even breathing hard. She was pinned, him on top of her on her stomach, her face pressed into the sweet, dusty hay. He was a living blanket of muscle and heat. The soldier stumbled into the stall. His light passed over them, over the pile of old hay in the corner where the other soldier was hidden. Nothing in here, the man slurred. He looked down. Nothing but horse shit. He turned and staggered out. Let's go, it's too cold. The stable door scraped shut. Hawk waited. He did not move. He waited until the footsteps were gone, until the sound of their voices had faded back toward the saloon. Then he moved, rolling off her in one silent motion. They were in the dark, kneeling, facing each other. Two shadows. "You!" she whispered, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with a wild, impossible shock. "You are here. They will hang you. Read," he said. "One word. He plans to kill your camp, at Red Willow. Women, children." "I heard," she whispered, the cold of his words meeting the cold of her own knowledge. "At dawn. He plans for you too," Hawk said, his voice flat. "I know," she said, her own voice hard. "A stray bullet. To silence me." They were no longer two people. They had one purpose. "My scouts are gone," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "To warn them. But I do not know if they are fast enough. I must go. I must lead them away." "You will never make it," she said, grabbing his arm. "The yard is full of them. You cannot outrun them all." "I will not outrun them," he said. "I will go through the creek. They watch the prairie. Not the water. I will be a shadow. But I need time. I need more time. Then I will get it for you," she said. He looked at her, a silhouette, but he could feel the sudden, iron strength in her. "What I am the cook," she said. The girl who had been afraid was gone. This was a woman he did not know. He said it. "We ride at 4. But they cannot ride without coffee. They cannot ride without breakfast. My father is useless. I am the only one." She smiled, a hard, sharp smile in the dark. "Maybe the coffee is too salty. Maybe the bacon burns. Maybe I forget where the flour is. Maybe I get so very sick. I will get you your time." "Hawk." He stared at her. He saw the fire in her. The same fire he had, the fire of the survivor. "It is dangerous," he said. "So I'm staying here," she replied. "Now, go." He stood. He had to leave. But he could not. He turned back. In the darkness, he reached for her. He did not touch her face. He did not kiss her. He pulled her to his feet, into his arms. It was not a gentle hug. It was a hard, desperate embrace, a collision. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her so tight against his chest she could not breathe, his face buried in her hair. He held her as if she were an anchor, the only real thing in a world of lies and fire. He pulled back, his hands on her shoulders. His voice was a scrape, a sound from the bottom of his soul. Half his language, half hers. "If I die, Pia," his voice was rough. "Remember, you were my sky." She did not cry. She would never cry in front of him. She fisted her hands in the front of his shirt, holding him with all her strength. "Then do not die," she whispered, her voice a fierce, burning thing. "I still need you more than air, too." He let her go. 1 second, he was there, a solid, warm presence. The next, he was gone. A whisper of cold air, the faintest sound of a shifting shadow. And the stable was empty again. Dawn was a promise, a pale, gray, sick line in the east, far away. A horse pushed beyond its limits, its lungs burning, its hooves pounding the earth, raced toward the Red Willow. Hawk rode low, his face a mask of stone, his eyes on the sun. He had to beat the sun. On the porch of Blake's Crossing, Captain Nathan Reed, magnificent in his clean uniform, raised a cup of coffee. He tasted it, and his face twisted. "What is this salt?" He threw the cup into the dust, just as Evie, her face pale, her hand over her stomach, leaned out of the kitchen door. "I'm so sorry, Captain," she moaned. I feel terribly sick." Reed stared at her, his eyes full of suspicion and rage. His men, groaning and hung over, were stumbling, waiting for breakfast, waiting for the coffee that would not come. Hawk had his time. The sun was a high, hot weight in the sky when Captain Reed and his column of 30 men reached the Red Willow Valley. Evie's delay, her campaign of spilled beans, salted coffee, and sudden, violent sickness had cost him almost 3 hours. He rode with a black, cold fury in his heart. He held up his gloved hand. The column of soldiers and deputized drifters stopped. their horses blowing, the leather of their saddles creaking in the sudden silence. The valley was quiet. Too quiet. Reed spurred his horse forward. Trotting into the center of the clearing, he saw the camp. Perhaps 15 lodges, their poles standing stark against the sky. But the hides were gone. The cooking fires were circles of cold, gray ash. The racks for drying meat were empty. The camp was gone, they knew, Reed whispered, his voice a low, terrifying hiss. He turned his head, slowly, and looked back at the men. His eyes, chips of blue ice, passed over the nervous soldiers, over the sullen face of Chance Murphy. His gaze found Thomas Blake, who sat his horse near the back, his face a pasty, sick gray. And then his eyes landed on Evie. Her sickness had miraculously passed the moment Reed had lost his patience, grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, and forced her onto a spare horse. "You will ride where I can see you, girl," he had snarled. She was a prisoner, her arms tied, her horse's lead rope tied to the saddle of a grim-faced soldier. She was here to be the witness, the justification. "A spy," Reed said, his voice carrying in the dead air. "We have an Indian spy in our midst." His eyes stayed locked on Evie. "They knew we were coming. Someone told them." He looked at Thomas Blake, who flinched. Or perhaps two. A war cry shattered the silence. It came not from the empty camp, but from the high rocks that rimmed the valley. "Ambush," a soldier screamed, fumbling for his rifle. It was not an ambush. It was a sacrifice. A dozen warriors, painted for death, rose from the rocks. They were the rear guard, the ones who had stayed behind to buy time for the women and children. At their head, a warrior with a face of carved stone, was Red Elk. A volley of arrows rained down, thudding into the earth, into the chests of horses. One of the drifters screamed, clutching his throat, an arrow protruding from his neck as he toppled from his saddle. The valley floor, which had been a still life, erupted into a screaming, smoky hell. The soldiers, disorganized, broke formation and fired wildly at the rocks. Reed's horse reared, and he fought it, his face a mask of rage. Form a line, fire at will, kill them all from a different ridge. A high, lonely place that overlooked the entire battle. Another rifle spoke. The sound was clean, sharp, distinct from the soldiers' clumsy volleys. A soldier was leveling his rifle at Red Elk. Before he could fire, a bullet struck his weapon, shattering the wooden stock and sending splinters into his face. The soldier cried out, dropping the useless gun. Hawk. He was on his belly, a quarter-mile away, his breath steady, his eyes sighted down the barrel. He had not been fast enough to warn the camp his scouts had done that, but he had been fast enough to get here, to this perch, to do what he had to do. He fired again. A man, one of Murphy's, was taking aim at a warrior. Hawk's bullet struck the rock just in front of his face, sending a spray of burning stone chips into his eyes. The man shrieked, clawing at his face, his shot going wide. Hawk was not shooting to kill. He was shooting to wound, to disarm, to confuse. He was trying to stop the fight before it became a massacre. Red Elk saw it. He saw the soldier's rifle break. He saw the other man fall back, screaming but alive. He knew that rifle. He knew that shot. He looked up at the high ridge and saw the small, distant puff of smoke. "Takani," he roared, his voice thick with betrayal. "Coward, you fight for them, you protect the white men." He turned, his fury redirected, and buried his hatchet in the chest of a soldier who was trying to reload. Hawk, he thought, was a traitor to his own blood, in the middle of the chaos. Evie sat frozen on her horse, her hands bound to the saddle horn. A bullet buzzed past her ear like an angry wasp. A man, not 10 feet away, was shot from his horse. He fell, his boot caught in the stirrup, and his terrified horse dragged him, screaming, through the dust. This was her fault. Her delay had not worked. Her presence had only made Reed more determined. She saw her father, his face blank with terror, his pistol still in its holster. He was not fighting. He was just waiting to die. Do something. She screamed at him, but her voice was lost in the gunfire. She had to stop this. She was the one they were avenging. With a sudden, desperate strength, she twisted her hands, pulling the ropes against the sharp edge of the saddle horn. The rope was old. It bit into her wrists, but it began to fray. She looked down. The soldier who had been her guard was on the ground, an arrow in his leg. She was free. She looked around, frantic. She needed a sign, a white flag. She had nothing. She reached into her pocket, her fingers, raw and bleeding, closed on the one thing she had, the wadded cloth she had taken from her sewing kit, the bandage she had used on Hawk's arm. She pulled it out. It was stiff, stained dark brown with his dried blood. It was all she had. She kicked the horse, a horse she did not control, with all her might. The animal, surprised, leaped forward, breaking into a panicked run. She guided it with her knees, her bound hands pulling uselessly at the reins. She rode directly into the open, bloody ground between the two lines of fire. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, tearing sound. "Stop it, please! It is a lie! It is all a lie! There are no women here!" She had a mad vision. A girl with her hair wild, her dress torn, her hands bound, waving a bloody rag in the middle of a gunfight. The shooting faltered. The soldiers stared. The warriors on the ridge paused. Red Elk, his knife bloody, stared at the white woman who was screaming about a lie. From his perch, Hawk's heart stopped. "No," he whispered. "No, Evie, get down." Captain Reed saw her. He saw his justification, his excuse, his witness, riding into the open, screaming that it was a lie. She was not hysterical. She was not a victim. She was a threat. "She is a witch," Reed bellowed, his voice rising above the sudden quiet. "She is one of them. She is bewitched. Look, she waves their bloody flag." This was his chance, the stray bullet he had planned. He raised his rifle, took a calm, steady aim at the center of her back, and his finger tightened on the trigger. Hawk saw the movement. He saw the rifle settle. He knew. He did not have time to aim. He did not have time to think. He fired. His bullet was not meant for Reed. It was meant for her horse. The bullet struck the animal high in the neck. The horse let out a single, gurgling scream and collapsed, its legs folding. The sudden stop threw Evie clear. She was tossed from the saddle, her bound hands ripping free, and she landed, hard, in the dust. Reed fired at the same instant. The hawk was already moving. He had abandoned his rifle, his cover, and was on his horse, which he had hidden in the rocks. He spurred it, a reckless, suicidal charge down the scree slope, his eyes locked on the spot where she had fallen. He saw Reed aiming again. Hawk kicked his horse into a final, desperate burst of speed. He drove the animal directly between Reed's rifle and Evie's unmoving form on the ground. Reed's second shot rang out. The bullet, meant for Evie, struck Hawk. It was a hammer blow, a fist of pure fire that tore into his left shoulder. Spinning him from the saddle, he landed with a heavy, bone-jarring thud, his body skidding in the dirt, just feet from her. Evie gasped. The air knocked from her. She looked up. She saw Hawk, his face a mask of pain, his shirt dark with blood. Hawk Chance Murphy, who had been hiding behind a rock, saw it all. His eyes lit up. The Comanche was down. The man who had cost him his scalps. This was a gift. "Got you now, you red bastard," Murphy growled, stepping from cover. He raised his pistol, taking careful, deliberate aim at Hawk's unprotected back. Evie saw him. She saw the pistol. She saw Hawk trying to push himself up with his good arm. She did not think. She did not plan. She was a creature of pure instinct. No! She launched herself from the ground. A low, desperate tackle. She slammed into Hawk's side, her body hitting him with all her weight. She screamed as Murphy's gun fired. The force of her blow pushed Hawk flat to the ground. The bullet, meant for his spine, tore through the air where his heart had been. But I did not miss it. Evie cried out, a sound of white-hot, tearing pain. The bullet had ripped through the fleshy part of her left arm. Blood, hot and sudden, exploded from the wound. It spattered her dress. It spattered Hawk's face. She collapsed on top of him, a dead weight, her blood dripping onto his. Silence, a deep, profound, stunned silence. Red Elk, his hatchet frozen in his hand, stood on the rocks. He had seen it. He had seen a white woman, the enemy, The justification for this war, throw herself in front of a bullet to save a Comanche. His entire world, a world built on black and white, on hate and on blood, tilted on its axis. Hawk was pinned. Evie was on top of him, a warm, bleeding weight. He did not know if she was alive. He only knew her blood was on his lips. Murphy cursed, his face ugly. Stupid girl. He pulled back the hammer for another shot, an easy shot, but Hawk was not finished. With a roar that was not human, a sound of pure animal rage, he used his one good arm to heave Evie's limp body off him, rolling her, trying to get her to safety. He rose to his knees, his left shoulder a sheet of fire, his right hand, impossibly, holding his knife. Murphy, surprised by the resurrection, fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust. Hawk was on him. It was not a fight. It was a reckoning. Murphy was a scavenger, a bully. Hawk was a warrior, and he was fueled by pain and a rage that went beyond his wounds. He ducked under Murphy's clumsy pistol whip. His good arm, his right arm, drove the knife in, once, deep, under the ribs and up. He drove the blade with all the strength he had left, with the memory of his mother, with the sight of Evie's blood. Chance Murphy's eyes went wide, his mouth opened, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He looked down at the hilt of the knife buried in his chest. He let go of his pistol. He slid from Hawk's grasp and crumpled to the ground, his small, mean life spilling into the prairie dust. Hawk stood over him, weaving. He was covered in his blood, and in her blood. He pulled his knife free. He was dying on his feet, but he was standing. "Demon," Reed whispered. His hands were shaking. His plan was ashes. His star witness was a traitor. His paid killer was dead. His men were cowering, their rifles forgotten. He was alone. He raised his pistol. The last man in his own personal war. He aimed it, with a trembling hand, at Hawk's heart. No, the shout was not from a warrior. It was from a barman. Thomas Blake had watched it all. He had sat on his horse, frozen, a coward, as his world came apart. He had watched his daughter be vilified. He had watched her ride into gunfire. He had watched her be shot. He saw Reed, the man who had blackmailed him, the man who had paid him, the man who had destroyed his daughter, aiming his pistol. The lifetime of weakness, of fear, of whiskey and shame, burned away in one final, redeeming spark. He was not a warrior. He was not a soldier. He was a father. He launched himself from his horse, his body hitting Captain Reed's back like a sack of grain. The two men went down, rolling in the dust. Reed's pistol flew from his hand. "You fool," Reed shrieked, his voice high and thin. "You drunken, idiotic fool. She is a whore. I will kill you all." Reed was younger. He was faster. He scrambled in the dust, his fingers clawing, grabbing the pistol. Thomas was on his back, but he grabbed Reed's arm. "You will not touch her." He roared, his voice full of a lifetime of buried rage. Reed snarled, a true animal sound. He was stronger. He turned the gun, twisting it, trying to break Thomas's grip, trying to point it at the older man's chest. "I will kill you first!" They struggled. Two white men, their faces inches apart, their hands locked on the weapon. The remaining soldiers stared, unsure who to shoot. Red Elk watched, his face a mask of stone. Hawk stood, bleeding, watching. The gun went off. The sound was deafening, final, echoing in the valley. Both men froze. Captain Reed's eyes went wide. He looked down. His own hands, and Thomas Blake's hands, were still locked on the gun. But the pistol, twisted in the struggle, was not pointed at Thomas. It was pressed, hard, into Reed's own immaculate blue uniform, just below the ribs. A dark red spot, black in the harsh sun, began to spread. He looked at Thomas, his expression one of pure, blank surprise. He let go. The pistol fell to the dirt. He slumped back, his eyes open, staring at the empty blue sky he had tried to conquer. The battle was over. Red Elk slowly, very slowly, lowered his hatchet. The remaining soldiers looked at their dead captain. They looked at the dead bounty hunter. They dropped their rifles. It was finished. Thomas Blake pushed himself to his feet. He was covered in dust. He looked at his hands. He looked at the dead man. He turned. His daughter was on the ground, her hand pressed to her bleeding arm, her face white with pain. The Comanche warrior. His shoulder a ruin was standing, swaying, but he was between Evie and the soldiers. A protector. Thomas took a step, then another. The three of them stood in the middle of the valley. A triangle of survivors. The smoke of the battle rising around them like a prayer. The silence that fell on the Red Willow Valley was heavier and more profound than the gunfire had been. It was the sound of an ending. The surviving soldiers, their faces gray with shock and powder, looked at their dead captain. They looked at the bloody, sprawled body of Chance Murphy. They looked at the ridge, where the Comanche warriors had not moved. And on the rocks, Red Elk stood. He had watched the entire, impossible drama unfold. He had seen the white girl, the one he had wanted to kill, throw herself in front of a bullet for Takani. He had seen her take the lead. He had seen her fall, her blood mixing with Hawk's. He looked down at Hawk, who was swaying on his feet, his left shoulder a ruin of red, his knife still dripping in his hand. He looked at Evie, who was pushing herself up, her hand clamped to her own bleeding arm, her face a mask of white pain. He looked at the older white man, Thomas Blake, who stood over the dead captain, his hands shaking, his face a picture of stunned, awful realization. Red Elk made a decision. This fight was over. It was not a fight he understood any longer. He raised his hand, palm out, to his remaining warriors. It was not a sign of surrender. It was a sign of enough. He turned, without a word, and he and his men, the ones who had stayed to die, melted back into the rocks. They were gone. Thomas Blake stumbled across the ground, his legs like water. "Evie!" he choked, his voice raw. He reached for her. She flinched as he touched her, her pain making her cry out. Hawk, who had finally dropped to one knee, his body refusing to obey him, looked up. His eyes were black with pain, but they were locked on Evie. "You are bleeding," he forced out, the words a low growl. "So are you," she whispered, her own voice shaking. She tried to go to him, but her legs would not hold her. Thomas Blake, the coward, the man who had sold his daughter for a bag of coins, finally acted. He looked at his daughter's arm, at the dark blood pumping from the wound. He looked at the dead captain. He ripped a long strip of cloth from the dead man's clean, white shirt. "Here," he said, his voice a croak. He handed the cloth to Evie, his hands shaking violently. He knelt beside her, his movements clumsy, and helped her wrap it tight around her arm. "We have to go," one of the soldiers said, his voice cracking. "We have to get back." The ride back was a slow, agonizing procession. The soldiers, leaderless and broken, carried their dead. Thomas Blake rode beside his daughter, his hand gripping her horse's bridle, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he expected her to vanish. Hawk rode behind them, a silent, bleeding, dark figure. He was their rear guard. He would not leave her, not until she was safe, not until he knew. Blake's crossing received them in a stunned, awful silence. The story that the surviving soldiers told was not the clean, righteous tale Reed had promised. It was a confused, bloody, terrible mess. Captain Reed was dead, shot in a struggle with his own gun. Chance Murphy was dead, gutted by the Comanche warrior. And Evie Blake, the girl they had jeered at, the girl they had called a Comanche lover, had taken a bullet, by her own choice, to save the warrior's life. The town did not know what to believe. The narrative of their righteous anger had crumbled into dust. Some men still spat, turning their backs, muttering traitor and whore, as Evie was helped from her horse. But others were silent, the men who had drunk Reed's free whiskey and cheered his plan for a massacre, now looked at the bodies being unloaded. They looked at Evie, her face pale but her back straight, and they looked at the tall, bleeding Comanche who sat his horse at the edge of the post, watching, his black eyes a silent judgment. The certainty was gone. Doubt, thick and muddy, had begun to seep in. People started to whisper. Whispers about Reed's ambition. Whispers about how he had pushed too hard. Whispers, finally, about the night Miguel was shot, and how maybe, just maybe, it had been a soldier's bullet all along. Maggie O'Reilly ran from the kitchen, her face a pale mask of terror. When she saw Evie, alive, she let out a sound, half sob, half scream. "You child, oh, you brave, foolish, stupid, wonderful child," she wept, her arms going around Evie, helping her inside. She saw the dark, bleeding figure of Hawk, sitting on his horse just beyond the yard, watching them. Maggie met his eyes. She nodded. Once, a sign of thanks. Hawk held her gaze. Then, seeing Evie was safe inside, he turned his horse and was gone. He melted into the landscape, a ghost returning to the hills. That night, Thomas Blake stood in the doorway of his daughter's room. Maggie had cleaned and bandaged Evie's arm. The bullet had passed clean through, a miracle of flesh and not bone. She was lying on her cot, her eyes closed, her face pale, but she was not asleep. "Evie," her father said. Her father. His voice was not the weak, whiskey-soaked voice she knew. It was a dry, broken, old man's voice. She opened her eyes. He was not drunk. He had not had a drink since the battle. He stood there, twisting his hat in his hands, a man hollowed out by his own shame. "I was afraid," he whispered, his eyes on the floor. "He said he would take the post. He knew I was afraid of what men would say, afraid of being what they called your mother." He looked up, and his eyes were flooded with a terrible, useless regret. "I took his money. I let them say those things. About you, my own girl." He took a step into the room, his hands shaking. "And then I saw you ride out, into the guns, and I saw you take that bullet. For him." He finally broke. A dry, racking sob tore from his chest. He sank onto the small stool by her bed. "Your mother always said silence can kill. I thought she was being dramatic. But she was right. My silence killed her. And it almost killed you." He reached out a trembling hand, but did not dare touch her. "I am sorry, Evelyn. I am so sorry. For all of it. For not being the man she was. For not being the man you are." Evie looked at her father. She saw, for the first time, not the man who had failed her, but just a man, a weak, broken, and terrified man. She felt a profound, aching pity. She could not hate him, but she did not know if she could ever trust him again. She laid her good hand on his. "I know, Pa," she whispered. "I know." And in that moment, she knew. She could not stay. She loved this broken man. She would not abandon him, not today, but she could not go back. She could not be the girl who served whiskey and stew to men who would, for the price of a free drink, agree to a massacre. She could not live in a world of lies. She wanted a life she had chosen, a life where her actions, her heart, were not a thing to be hidden. 2 days later, Hawk reached the high caves. His people were safe. His scouts had arrived just in time. The Red Willow camp had been evacuated hours before Reed arrived, leaving only the warriors who had chosen to stay. He was brought before the elder. His shoulder had been stitched, not by Evie's neat hand, but by a warrior's rough gut thread. Red Elk was there. He stood before the council, and he spoke. He did not speak of Takani's betrayal. He spoke of the white woman. He spoke of her screaming that it was a lie. He spoke of her riding into the battle. He spoke of her own arm bleeding, throwing her body in front of Takani. "She has a Numunu heart," Red Elk said, using the word for his own people. "A strong heart. They are not all the same. Not all are devils." The elder listened. He looked at Hawk. "The world is changing," the old man said, his voice heavy. "The white man's poison, his greed, it spreads. We must go. We will move north, to the deep lands. We must go where they will forget us." He looked at Hawk, his eyes kind but firm. "And you, Takani, you must come. Your people need your arm. They need your spirit. You must heal. You must be one of us." Hawk's head was bowed. My heart," he said, The word's a confession. It is. It is in 2 pieces, the elder finished for him. Here, and with her, I know, but a warrior's heart cannot be split. Takani, if you try, it will be torn apart. Go with us. Heal your body. Heal your spirit. Then you will know which path to walk. A week passed. Blake's Crossing was quiet. The soldiers had returned to the fort, their report throwing the entire command into chaos. Reed was dead. The Indian War was, for now, over. Evie's arm was healing. She was back in the kitchen, but she was not the same. She was no longer just working. She was packing. She had a small wooden box. In it, she placed her mother's hairbrush, her small sewing kit, a book her mother had given her. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she was not staying. He came at dusk, just as he had the first night. She was outside, behind the stable, in the spot where she had first seen him on the ridge. A lonely silhouette. She was looking at that ridge, and when she turned, he was simply there. He stood beside his horse, his arm in a crude buckskin sling. He looked thinner, his face drawn with pain and exhaustion, but he was alive. He was here. Her heart did a slow, painful flip. "You came back," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I came," he said. His voice was low, rough. "We are leaving, my people. We go north, far away, a long ride." The words hit her like a physical blow. Of course, she had known. "Oh," she said, her voice small, her gaze fallen to the dust. "That is good. It is safer. For you." "My people need me," he said, as if explaining it to himself. "I must go. I must be whole." "I know," she said. She looked back at the house, where a single yellow light glowed in her father's window. "My father is a broken man." "I cannot leave him. Not like this. Not yet." She turned back to him, and her voice, when it came, was stronger, full of the iron she had found in herself. "But I will not wither here. Hawk, I will not stay in that kitchen and serve men who wanted to kill you. And then me. I am leaving, too. Soon. I just do not know where I am going." He looked at her, truly looked at her, at the new, hard strength in her eyes. In a proud way she held her head, at the girl who had become a woman in a canyon of fire and blood. He took a step, and then another. He stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the sage and the smoke. He did not touch her, not with his hands. Slowly, his eyes holding hers, he bent his head. He lowered his face, and with an infinite, gentle care, he pressed his forehead against hers. Evie closed her eyes, a sharp, sudden shiver running down her spine. His skin was hot, his breath was warm. It was not a kiss. It was something more. A Comanche promise. A joining of spirits. "I see you. You are one with me. If you are out there," she whispered, her eyes still closed, her forehead pressed against his. "And you are alone, and you need anything." Her voice caught a small, choked sound, but she forced the words out. "I can cook, I can patch your clothes, I can laugh with you, I can argue with you." She took a shaky breath. "I can be your home. Hawk, if you need one." He pulled back, just an inch, just enough so he could see her face. His eyes, those black, intense, unreadable eyes, were not sad. They were burning, and a small, slow, real smile touched his lips. He said the words, the ones she had been waiting for, but this time, they were not a joke. They were not about food. They were not a desperate plea. They were a statement, a fact. "Stay," he said, his voice a low, rough vow that the wind could not steal. "I need you more than air." A single tear, hot and sudden, escaped the corner of her eye. She did not wipe it away. She laughed, a small, watery sound, but it was a laugh. "Then come back," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Come back and ask me properly." He held her gaze for a long second. It was a promise. It was a vow. He did not say goodbye. He touched his own forehead. Once. A sign of memory. He turned. With his one good arm, He swung up onto his horse. He looked at her one last time. Then he turned the horse and rode, not into the darkness, but toward the setting sun, which had turned the entire western sky into a great, burning, hopeful fire of red and gold. Evie stood and watched. She watched until he was no longer a man on a horse. She watched until he was just a speck. She watched until the speck was swallowed by the land, by the red dust. She stood until the air was cold and the stars had come out. Then she turned. She did not cry. She walked back into the house, past her father, who had fallen asleep in his chair, a cold, empty fireplace at his feet. She went to her small room. She pulled her battered leather bag from under the bed, and, with a steady, certain hand, she began to pack. The world did not change all at once, but it changed. The seasons turned. The blood on the Red Willow Valley floor was washed away by the spring rains and became part of the land, just as the men who had fallen there did. At Blake's Crossing, the silence was a heavy, unbroken thing. Captain Reed was gone, buried with the other soldiers. The fort was quiet, run by a new, older, and much less ambitious officer who mostly wanted to complete his service and go home. The railroad, which Reed had promised like a new gospel, had surveyed its line 20 miles to the south, following a different river. The boom had busted before it even began. Blake's Crossing was not going to be a town. It was just what it had always been, a lonely post on a long, empty stretch of road. Thomas Blake was a different man. He was quieter. He was sober. The terror of that day had burned the weakness from him, but it had left him an old man, a shell. He ran to the bar, but the whiskey bottles seemed to stay full. The men who came in were quiet, respectful. The story of what had happened, the real story, cobbled together from the soldiers' stunned confessions and Evie's quiet, unshakable testimony, had settled over the prairie. Evie stayed through that long, hard winter. She cooked for her father. She tended the bar. She watched him. She saw the way his hands shook, not from drink, but from memory. She saw the way he looked at her, with a terrible, aching reverence, as if she were a ghost he had wronged. When spring came, she packed her bag. He did not try to stop her. He had been waiting for it. He went to a loose board under his own bed and pulled out a small, heavy cloth bag. It was the money he had saved, the money he had taken from Reed. He had not touched a coin. "This is yours," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He pushed it across the kitchen table. "It was your mother's. In a way, I was saving it for your wedding. A dowry. I do not need a dowry." "Pa," she said, her voice gentle, but firm. "No," he said, "you do not, but take it. As for my apology, for all the years I was not her husband, for the day I was not your father." She took the money. She saw it not as a payment, but as his first, fumbling step toward freeing himself. She did not go far. She went a mile east, to the small, clear creek that ran near the ridge where he used to watch. She bought the land with her money, and she hired 2 men from the fort, the ones who had been kindest, to help her build. It was not a saloon. It was a house. It was built of new pine, 2 rooms on the main floor and a sleeping loft above. The main room was the kitchen and eatery. It was clean. It was simple, and on the whitewashed walls, Evie hung the small, faded watercolor paintings of prairie flowers that her mother had painted, the ones that had been packed in a trunk for 20 years. She called it, simply, the Crossing Inn. She cooked. Word spread. Her food was clean, and it was honest. Cowboys came, and they found they were expected to take their hats off and to speak quietly. Their horses were fed, their bellies were filled, and they were charged a fair price. Emigrant wagons, heading west, found it a place of strange, quiet decency. Maggie O'Reilly, who had left Thomas Blake to his ghosts, came to live and work with her. The 2 women ran the place. It was hard work, but it was their own. And sometimes they had different guests. A family of Kiowa, moving south, would stop. They had heard. They would sit by the creek, and Evie would bring them a pot of hot stew and a sack of flour. She would not take their money. She would trade for a well-tanned hide or a string of dried herbs. She would treat them as she treated the soldiers, as guests, as people. The place became a small, strange island of peace on the prairie. It was late summer. The wind was high and hot, carrying the smell of drying grass. Evie was on the small porch, wrestling with a tablecloth, the wind trying to rip it from her hands. When she heard it, it was not the jingle of a cavalry patrol. It was not the heavy clop of a freight wagon. It was a single horse, its gait long, fast, and familiar. She stopped. The tablecloth fell from her hands, and the wind took it, sending it tumbling across the yard like a huge, white bird. She did not care. She shaded her eyes. He was coming from the north, a single rider. He was not riding fast. He was not riding slow. He was just coming. He rode into the yard and stopped. He did not dismount immediately. He was thinner. The hollows under his high cheekbones were deeper. His left shoulder was scarred, and it sat a little lower than his right, but it was healed. His long, black hair was tied back with a leather thong. He looked at the new, clean house. He looked at the sign. He looked at the white tablecloth, tumbling away. Then his eyes, those black, deep, desert eyes, found her. She stood on the porch, her hand at her throat, her heart a wild, trapped thing in her chest. He was here. He was alive. He swung his leg over the horse. He was stiff, his body forever changed by the bullet, but he moved with the old, silent grace. He stood by his horse, his hand on its neck, and he just looked at her. He did not step forward. He would not cross the yard. He would not claim. He was giving her the choice. She could run inside. She could bar the door. She could tell him to go. Evie let out a breath she had been holding for 6 months. A slow, shaky smile touched her lips. It was a real smile, a smile that reached her eyes. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked down the 2 steps, into the yard, and she stopped, 10 feet from him. "You are late," she said, her voice clear, carrying over the wind. She used a word he had taught her, a Comanche word for slow. "The kitchen is warm." He let out his own breath, the line of his jaw, which had been as hard as stone, softened. "I was delayed," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He had not used his English in a long time. He told her, in short, clipped sentences. His people were safe, far to the north, in the highlands where the buffalo still ran. They were hidden. They were for now free. The elder, the old man, had given his blessing. Hawk was to be their messenger, their bridge. "He told me," Hawk said, his gaze fixed on her face, "that my heart was torn. He told me to go, to find the other half. He had chosen. He had ridden south for weeks. Following the memory of her, he had come back. He had come back to the woman who, he finally admitted to himself, had saved him not from Reed's bullet, but from the long, slow, cold death of his own loneliness. They stood like that for a long time, the wind blowing between them, the world silent, waiting. Finally, she broke the spell. "Well," she said, turning her back to him, a gesture of absolute, profound trust. "The stew will not stir itself. Are you coming inside, or are you going to stand in my yard all day?" She walked back to the house. She went into her kitchen. The room was warm, filled with the smell of baking bread and roasting meat. She untied the ribbon that held her hair and tied on a long, clean apron. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She picked up a wooden spoon and began to stir the pot. He was standing in the doorway. He was a shadow against the bright, impossible light of the prairie. A warrior, a hunter, a ghost. He looked too big for her small, clean room. He looked at her. Her back was to him. Her arm was moving, stirring the pot. She turned her head. Her face flushed from the heat of the fire, a dusting of flour on her cheek. She gave him the same hard smile she had given him in the dark of the stable. "I can cook," she whispered, her voice a promise, "and I can stay." She took a breath. "If you will have me." He crossed the room in 2 strides. He was a force of nature. He was a hawk, diving. He stopped in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to see his face. He raised his hand. Not the scarred one, the other, his fingers, rough and calloused, went to her cheek. He did not wipe the flour away. He just touched her. He touched her as if she were a new, strange, and precious thing, as if he were a blind man, learning to see. His black eyes, no longer haunted, no longer full of rage, but full of a deep, quiet, and terrible need, held hers. "Stay," he said, his voice a raw, broken, beautiful sound. It was not a desperate plea this time. It was not a half-joke about food. It was a prayer. It was the answer. "I need you more than air." She did not answer with words. She dropped the spoon, and it clattered to the floor. She stepped into him, her arms, her one good arm and the one with the healed scar, wrapping around his waist. She pressed her face into the worn, soft leather of his shirt, and she held on. He stood, frozen for a second, as if he had forgotten what a touch was. Then his own arms came around her, his good arm and the one that was scarred, and they wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest, holding her, his hand burying itself in her hair, his head bent, his face pressed against her head. They did not kiss. They did not speak. They just stood in the middle of her warm kitchen. Two survivors, two outcasts, two halves of a heart that had been torn by the world. And they held each other. They just held on. They were home. The years passed. The house by the creek grew. A stable was added. Then a small trading post, where Hawk traded fairly with his own people, who now knew this as a safe place. One afternoon, in the summer, on the porch of the house, a small boy was playing. He was perhaps 4 years old, his skin the color of warm, new leather, his hair a tangle of dark brown, his eyes black and deep, full of a fierce, happy light. He was laughing, a high, clear sound, as his father, Hawk, showed him how to balance a small, blunted knife. Hawk, his hair now streaked with a little gray at the temples, his left shoulder still stiff but strong, knelt on the porch, his face soft with a look of pure, quiet pride. "No, Tassi," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Like this. Watch the bird. You must be like a bird." The boy laughed and threw the knife. It missed the log completely and landed in the dust. "Supper," a voice called from inside. Evie came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She was no longer a girl. She was a woman. Her face had lines now, fine ones, around her eyes, from smiling into the sun. Her hair was pulled back, but the same light was in her eyes. She looked at her husband and her son, and her heart was so full it ached. As she watched, 2 old men on horseback rode into the yard. They were Comanche. They were the elders. They nodded to Evie. "Little mother who heals," one of them said, greeting her with the name they had given her. Hawk went to them, and they spoke in their own tongue, a fast, low conversation about the herds, about the new agent at the fort. It was normal. It was life. A wagon, a big, canvas-covered emigrant wagon, pulled up, the family in the front staring. They saw the white woman, the Indian man, the mixed child, the old warriors, all talking on the porch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The man on the wagon looked confused. "Ma'am, is this a safe place to stop?" Evie smiled, a wide, warm smile. She picked up a stack of plates. "It is the safest place for 100 miles, she said. "And the stew is ready. You are all welcome." She looked at the Comanche elders. "You, too. It is a good stew today." She went inside, and they all followed her. The emigrant family and the old warriors, they sat at different tables, but in the same room. And they ate. Evie and Hawk had not changed the world. They had not stopped the wars, or the greed, or the hate. But here, on this small patch of prairie, by a small, clear creek, they had built a place where the rules were different. They had built a place where the law was not based on the color of a man's uniform, or the color of his skin, but on the simple, decent way one person treated another. Their love had become a legend, a small, whispered story that travelers told, the story of the Comanche and the white woman, who kept the post where everyone was safe. That night, after the child was asleep, after the last of the travelers had bedded down, Evie and Hawk sat on the porch steps. The prairie was a vast, dark, silver sea under a million stars. The air was cool, smelling of sage and the coming night. A coyote yipped, far off, and an owl answered. He reached over and took her hand. His hand, rough and scarred, closed over hers. Her own hand, also scarred, also strong. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She had heard the words, every day, in the way he looked at her, in the way he touched their son, in the way he guarded their small, bright home. But she heard them still, in the quiet, in the touch of his hand. I need you more than air. She leaned her head against his shoulder, his good shoulder. She closed her eyes and let out a long, slow, contented sigh, breathing in the smell of him, and the night, and the life they had built. And I, she whispered, to the stars, and to him, I am finally breathing. The house was a single, small point of light in the vast, dark prairie. It was not a fortress. It was an anchor. It was a promise. It was home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm so glad you joined us for this tale. Please, let us know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really want to help, please press that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people. We will see you in the next story.